The Ship of Theseus. If you replace one plank of a ship, is it still the same ship? Of course, it must be. A single replacement does not destroy identity. If a shoe loses a lace and gains a new one, it remains your shoe. The shoe does not protest. The ship does not groan. Life carries on. But then you replace a second plank, and then a third, and another, and another. Eventually, not a single original piece remains. Every part has been replaced. So what now? Is this still the Ship of Theseus? If identity is continuity, then yes. But if identity is matter, then no. And if it's both, well, which part bends first? What if, from all those original planks removed, someone built another ship, reconstructed exactly as the first one was? Every curve, every nail, every flaw replicated perfectly. And it floats. It sails. It even creaks like the original. Now you have two ships, each laying claim to being the Ship of Theseus. One with continuity, one with origin. One that sailed the seas unbroken, and one that rose again like memory from a junkyard. Which is real? Which is the imposter? Or are both real, or neither? Maybe identity isn't in the parts at all. Maybe it's in the purpose, or in the name. But if a name makes a ship, then you can name anything and make it anything. A rock could be a bird if you name it one. That can't be right, can it? Or maybe it's not about the ship, but about the observer. Maybe the ship stays the same only as long as someone believes it is. But then, what happens when no one is watching? Does the ship vanish into irrelevance? Does it flicker between being and non-being like a paradoxical ghost? And if identity depends on memory, then do forgetful people own nothing real? Let's go deeper. Imagine Theseus himself returns, older now, walking the harbor, looking for his ship. He touches the rail and says, "Yes, this is it." But someone shows him the reassembled version made from the old parts, now docked nearby. His face tightens. He sees the old grain, the scars of battle in the wood. He runs his hand along the splinters he once bled on. And he says, "No, this is it." But he cannot have both. So the question comes like a riddle. Can something change entirely and yet remain the same? And what does that mean for people? If you've replaced your cells every 7 years, if your ideas evolve, if your memories decay, are you the same person you were? If not, who is living your life right now? We speak of identity like it's solid, but it shifts like water in cupped hands. Try to hold it, and it leaks through fingers. Try to name it, and it changes before the word ends. Perhaps there never was a Ship of Theseus, only stories that gave it shape, and hands that gave it form. Maybe the paradox is not in the ship at all, but in our obsession with permanence. Maybe the Ship of Theseus was always meant to sail, not stay whole. And so we drift, plank by plank, into the unknown. The Barber Paradox. There is a barber in a village. He shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. He does not shave anyone who does. So the question is sharp, clean-cut, and smiling like a razor. Who shaves the barber? If he does not shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber. But the barber only shaves those who do not shave themselves. So if he is shaved by the barber, he must not be shaved by the barber. And if he shaves himself, then he cannot shave himself, because the barber does not shave those who shave themselves. So he both must and must not shave himself. He exists in a contradiction with a face full of foam and a logic that refuses to rinse off. Is he both shaven and unshaven? Half-bearded in thought? Or does he simply not exist? But perhaps this is not about barbers at all. Perhaps it is about the limits of rules. The village barber becomes a mirror, reflecting the problem of self-reference. The rule breaks when applied to itself. It implodes inward, like a thought eating its own tail. What if the barber is just a metaphor for all systems that attempt to regulate themselves. Legal systems trying to judge their own legality. Languages describing themselves. Minds observing their own thoughts. Each becomes tangled, looping back into contradiction. The moment you make a rule about rulemakers, the paradox slips in. Suppose the barber decides not to shave anyone that day. Does the paradox vanish? Or does it sit quietly under his stubble, waiting? If he lets his beard grow, is the village safe? Or is the contradiction still humming under the surface, in the question itself? But maybe there is no real barber, just language, just logic twisted in such a way that it folds back. Like a Mobius strip. You follow one side and find yourself on the other. A single surface, pretending to be two. A statement that cannot be true without being false. A barber who cannot do his job without defying it. So the barber becomes Schrödinger's stylist. His existence oscillates between two states, a thought experiment wearing cologne. If he exists, logic fails. If he doesn't exist, logic still poses the question. He becomes an echo of paradox, one that mocks simple yes or no answers. You could say, just fire the barber, remove him, and the problem dissolves. But then what of systems that cannot fire their contradictions? What of truths that contain their own undoing? Can we remove the paradox without removing the system? Maybe the barber isn't a paradox. Maybe we are. Maybe we build rules so tightly we forget the spaces between them. Maybe we construct logic so rigid that it snaps when turned inward. Maybe the barber is a warning. About arrogance. About self-reference. About the illusion of perfect order. Who shaves the barber? Maybe it's the blade of the question itself, cutting open certainty, leaving us all a little unsure, a little stubbled, a little human. Liar Paradox. I am lying, says the voice. Clear, simple, unavoidable. And yet, in those two words, the world trembles. Because if the speaker is lying, then the statement is false, so they're not lying. But if they're not lying, then the statement is true, which means they are lying. Round and round. Truth devours itself. Language combusts in the space between honesty and deceit. What is a lie that declares itself a lie? What is a truth that makes itself false? This isn't just a puzzle. It's a hall of mirrors where no reflection is real for long. Say the sentence, and you're trapped. Believe it, and you must doubt. Doubt it, and you're forced to believe. It's a snake that bites its own tail and finds the poison is made of grammar. A sentence that denies itself should be nonsense, but it isn't. It's perfectly formed. It doesn't collapse under bad grammar or gibberish syntax. It's logical. It's linguistic. It's precise. And that's what makes it dangerous. A structure built to implode. Maybe the problem isn't the liar. Maybe it's the question we keep asking. Is it true? But how can something be true about itself? What happens when meaning turns the mirror back toward its own face? Suppose we tried to classify all statements as either true or false, clean and binary, on or off. But this one, this liar, it dances in between. It rejects the binary and builds a third space, neither true nor false, but unstable. Like standing on a floor that might be ceiling. Like light that is both wave and particle. The liar sentence says, truth is not enough. Language will break it. So maybe we try to contain it. We invent logic systems that exclude self-reference. We set rules. You cannot say this sentence. You cannot refer to yourself. We build fences around paradox and call them solutions. But what if the paradox is the gate? What if meaning always contains the seed of its own undoing? What does it mean to lie? To say something false with intent to deceive. But what if the lie is about the lie? What if the deceit is aimed at itself? The liar paradox is a mind staring at itself in the mirror, unsure if it's blinking. A sentence aware of its own betrayal. A thought looped so tightly that escape is impossible without breaking thought itself. Maybe the liar isn't a person, or a statement, or a flaw in logic. Maybe the liar is truth, exposed for what it is, conditional, context-bound, ever-shifting. Maybe the liar is language reminding us it was never designed to be perfect. That words can point to meaning, but never be meaning. That truth isn't a box. It's a balancing act. You read, "This statement is false," and think, "How silly." But deep down, you feel it scratching at the walls of your certainty. If even one sentence can't be judged as true or false, what happens to the rest? What if logic is just a net with gaps too small to see until something slippery, like the liar, slides through? Perhaps the liar paradox is not a problem to solve, but a riddle to sit with. A Zen koan in Western logic's vocabulary. It exists not to be defeated, but to disturb, to unravel the comfort of structure. To whisper, even language lies. Grandfather Paradox. Travel back in time and meet your grandfather before your parent was born. A quiet night, a twist of fate, and you accidentally, or intentionally, stop him from meeting your grandmother. Or worse, you ensure he doesn't survive the night. So now, your parent was never born. And you? You never existed. Except you did. You were the one who traveled, who acted, who caused the erasure. But without existence, how did you travel? Who pulled the trigger? Who made the choice? You are the effect of an action that undid its cause. A ghost that haunts its own birth. The paradox is not just in time. It's in logic, causality, identity. It's in the question of whether a river can flow upstream, erasing the spring that birthed it. The grandfather paradox is not just about murder. It's about contradiction with a time machine. Can the past be changed? If so, how do you protect consistency? And if it cannot be changed, what is the point of travel? Is the past fixed, immutable, or is the act of observation part of the structure? Are we passengers or sculptors of time? Maybe you didn't kill your grandfather. Maybe you just bumped into him, made him late, caused a series of events to spiral differently. He still meets your grandmother, but on a different day. Now your parent is born differently. A shift in genes. A butterfly in genetics. So, are you still you? Or someone else with your memories? And what if you go back not to kill, but to save? Prevent a tragedy. Stop a war. The same paradox applies. Because if you succeed, there's no reason to go back. So you never went. And if you never went, the tragedy wasn't prevented. And if it wasn't prevented, you go back. Again and again in a loop that refuses to resolve. So maybe time loops. Maybe all is predetermined. Maybe you were always meant to go back. To bump into him. To nudge history in precisely the way that created you. A closed circle of cause and effect. But then, where did the first cause come from? Where did the story begin? Who wrote the first line? A self-contained loop has no entry point, no first domino. So the paradox is born again. You caused your own existence by acting in the past. But that past only exists because of your actions. It's a bootstrap of identity, a paradox of origins. You might say, timelines branch. Kill your grandfather, and you simply jump tracks. A multiverse blooms. In one, you were never born. In another, you live on. But then, what is your responsibility? Which you is the real one? Did you escape the paradox, or just relocate it? Maybe time doesn't like to be twisted. Maybe the universe resists paradox, self-corrects, protects causality like a jealous god. Your actions backfire. The gun jams. The accident never happens. You try and fail, and fate marches on untouched. But if that's true, then what is free will in a time machine? A puppet show with no strings. The grandfather paradox isn't about time travel. It's about the fragility of cause, the arrogance of thinking we understand sequence. We say A causes B causes C, but what if A is the ghost of C? What if we walk in loops without knowing? In the end, maybe time is not linear, not branching, not circular, but something stranger. A tapestry, a web, a dimension we barely touch. And the grandfather paradox is the fray at the edge of that fabric, where logic unravels and existence questions itself. Because if you can unmake your own making, who or what made you in the first place? Omnipotence Paradox. Can an omnipotent being create a rock so heavy that even it cannot lift it? It sounds simple, almost childish. But in that question, every idea of power begins to fold in on itself. Because if the being can create such a rock, then it has created something it cannot lift. So it's not omnipotent. But if it cannot create the rock, then it's already limited. Either way, omnipotence breaks. To be all-powerful, then, is to have the power to limit oneself. But is that still power? Or surrender in disguise? If you can do anything, can you stop yourself from doing something? If yes, you are powerful. If no, you are powerful. If maybe, you're a paradox wearing a crown. Omnipotence becomes a trap, a power so absolute that it begins to devour itself. Infinite strength turns inward, becomes its own weakness. Power without boundaries is power without shape. And how can something without shape lift a rock at all? Is omnipotence the ability to do anything, even the impossible? If so, can it make a triangle with 4 sides? A married bachelor? A truth that is false? But if it can do the logically impossible, then logic no longer holds. And if logic no longer holds, we cannot ask the question, nor understand the answer. Power so infinite that it erases the language we use to describe it. Or perhaps the error is in the question, not the being. Perhaps the paradox is not a flaw in omnipotence, but in our limited framework. A rock so heavy it cannot be lifted cannot exist, because its definition negates itself. Like a fire so hot it burns cold. We chase contradictions and call them gods. But what if true omnipotence includes the ability to violate logic? Then, we are beyond paradox, beyond understanding. In that space, the being can lift the unliftable, can both create the rock and lift it, can both do and not do, can be and not be at the same time. And so, we lose our footing. There is no ground left. The rules we live by are optional suggestions. Gravity becomes a thought. Identity, a breath. Or maybe omnipotence isn't about doing anything. Maybe it's about knowing when not to. Maybe the most powerful thing is restraint. To create the rock and choose not to lift it. Not because you can't, but because power means letting go. Then omnipotence isn't paradoxical. It's intentional. Not infinite capability, but infinite discretion. But then, we must ask, does omnipotence mean the power to defy oneself, to undo one's own being? Can an all-powerful entity choose to be powerless? And if it can, does it stop being what it was? Does it vanish the moment it makes that choice? Or does omnipotence mean being beyond such choices? A force that contains contradictions without being torn by them. A state where the rock is never needed, because the question is never asked. A quiet power that never speaks, because speaking would break the illusion of separation. And so we are left with a being that can create a rock it cannot lift, and also lift it anyway, or not, depending on whether you ask the question at all. Because in the end, omnipotence might not be about rocks, or lifting, or gods. It might be about the limits of language to hold the infinite. And the paradox is just the crack in our vocabulary, through which the divine escapes. Achilles Paradox, Xenos. Achilles, swift of foot, chases a tortoise in a race. The tortoise has a head start. Achilles runs fast, but before he can reach where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved ahead. and again, and again. Each time Achilles reaches the point the tortoise occupied, the tortoise has inched forward, an infinite number of steps. And so, Achilles never passes the tortoise, not because he is slow, but because motion, apparently, is impossible. Here, speed means nothing. Strength means nothing. Time is irrelevant. The paradox whispers that to reach the finish line, you must first reach halfway. But to reach halfway, you must reach a quarter. Before that, an eighth, then a 16th, and on and on. An infinite sequence of distances, each one smaller, but never reaching zero. So Achilles, the great warrior, becomes a prisoner of mathematics, divided into smaller and smaller movements, until he vanishes into fractions. A god among men, trapped by numbers. Infinity becomes a wall, not a horizon. But the tortoise moves too, just slowly. And yet somehow in Zeno's world, that slow movement is enough to stay ahead, forever. Every attempt Achilles makes to close the gap only reveals another, tinier gap waiting. He becomes a paradox in motion, always getting closer, never arriving, always chasing, never catching. Movement becomes illusion. Distance becomes deception. But we've watched races. We know Achilles would overtake the tortoise quickly. So what's happening? The paradox lies not in the running, but in how we measure it. By dividing space infinitely, Zeno turned motion into a trap. If every journey is composed of infinite steps, how can anything ever move at all? And yet, we move. We watch cars pass. We drop stones and see them fall. So either motion is an illusion, or infinity is misunderstood. What if the infinite can be completed? What if, when Achilles runs, those infinite steps happen in finite time? A geometric series where the total sum converges. Half, then a quarter, then an eighth, adding to one whole. Movement is possible, because time, like distance, can be divided without delay. But then what is infinity? If we can cross it in a blink, is it real? If we can complete an infinite sequence, does that make it finite? Is infinity just a trick of division? Zeno says, even so, each step must be taken. You cannot skip the steps. And if each takes time, how can infinite steps not take forever? But Achilles replies, maybe time does not care. Maybe the universe does not wait for each mathematical moment to finish. Maybe movement is real, and your numbers are the illusion. Or maybe both are right. Maybe motion is real, but our attempts to describe it are flawed. Maybe the paradox is not about running at all, but about the limits of precision. About what happens when we slice a moment too thin. Achilles stands at the edge of infinity, foot lifted. The tortoise crawls ahead, infinitely small steps on an infinitely long line. They both move, but the paradox does not. It sits between them, unmoving, not a barrier, but a question. How many pieces must we break the world into before we stop seeing the world? How small can we slice time before it slips through our fingers? Perhaps motion is not a problem to solve, but a mystery to feel. Perhaps Zeno was right, and movement is impossible in theory, but undeniable in experience. We live in the space between logic and life. And somewhere, on that infinite track, Achilles smiles. Because he's already past the tortoise. And yet somehow, he never left. Paradox of tolerance. If a society is tolerant without limit, will it eventually be destroyed by the intolerant? The answer feels like it should be no. Tolerance should expand, like light. Inclusion should grow until no one is left out. But then comes the figure in the doorway, the one who demands to be tolerated while refusing to tolerate others. And now the room changes. The rules bend. And what was once open becomes twisted by its own kindness. If you tolerate intolerance, you allow it to grow. And if you do not tolerate it, you've become intolerant yourself. The paradox lives in that trap. To protect tolerance, you may have to be intolerant of certain things. But the moment you do that, the moral high ground shakes beneath you. So where does it end? Who decides what is intolerable? Is it hate speech, violence? Ideas that seem harmless today, but could fester tomorrow? And if you silence even one voice, even a hateful one, are you not creating the very suppression you claim to resist? Tolerance, then, becomes a balancing act on a blade. Lean too far into openness, and the very people who oppose openness will use your generosity as a weapon. Lean too far into rejection, and you become the thing you feared. You build a wall in the name of doors. The paradox asks, can freedom defend itself without contradiction? Can you protect the right to speak while denying it to those who would use it to destroy? If everyone deserves a voice, do even those who want to silence others deserve one too? Tolerance, when limitless, becomes vulnerable. Like a castle with no guards. Like a heart with no caution. It allows the intolerant to enter, to grow, to take root. And once rooted, the intolerant do not reciprocate. They do not protect the system that protected them. They close the gates behind them. They burn the books written in their defense. They weaponize the very space tolerance made. So what then? Do we set rules? Must tolerance draw its own line in the sand? If so, then tolerance is no longer absolute. It becomes conditional, based not on openness, but on survival. The sword of tolerance, sheathed until the intolerant arrive, now drawn in paradox. But who decides which ideas are too dangerous to allow? Who polices the intolerable? The state? The crowd? The algorithm? And what if the judge becomes intolerant under the mask of safety? What if the defense becomes the attacker? So we oscillate between fear and principle, between the world we want and the one we're trying to avoid. Tolerance can build a city, but it cannot protect it without contradiction. The more open the gates, the easier it is to be conquered from within. Perhaps the paradox is not meant to be solved, but understood. Tolerance must defend itself. But in doing so, it must occasionally become something it despises. It must draw boundaries, not because it hates, but because it hopes to preserve love. True tolerance does not mean welcoming all ideas. It means nurturing those that do not threaten the very ground they stand on. The paradox is that to protect openness, you must sometimes close the door. So tolerance becomes a paradox wearing armor, a shield against those who would destroy it, built from the very principles it swore never to break. Dichotomy Paradox. To reach a destination, one must first reach halfway. But to reach halfway, you must reach a quarter. And before that, an eighth, a 16th, an endless series of fractions stretching infinitely backward. So if there are infinite steps between you and your goal, how can motion ever begin? You start walking. But the logic says you never leave. Each step demands another step before it. You are trapped in an infinite regress, a hallway of shrinking doorways, each one waiting for you to cross, but each one demanding a smaller crossing first. The paradox isn't about speed, it's about division. If you divide a task into infinite parts, does it become impossible? Can infinity be walked through? In reality, we move, we step, we run, we fall, we fly. But in thought, we stall. Logic stretches the journey into eternity, and the act of crossing becomes absurd. How can you traverse an infinity of distances in a finite time? The sum of all these halves, quarters, eighths, mathematically, it converges. It adds up to a finite whole. The distance exists. It is real. So then why does logic protest? Why does motion feel impossible in theory, but obvious in practice? Because infinity does not exist in the world the way it does in the mind. In the mind, you can cut a second into 1 billion fragments. In the world, you blink, and you're already on the other side. Zeno didn't doubt motion. He walked. He breathed. But he posed this paradox to reveal the fault in our assumptions. That division always leads to clarity. That more precise steps mean better understanding. But in chasing infinite clarity, we sometimes miss the obvious truth. You're already moving. The dichotomy is not that motion is impossible, but that we think of it in still frames. That we imagine steps instead of flow. That we break things down until the whole dissolves into confusion. If you had to complete an infinite number of tasks before you could open a door, you would never open it. But you do, every day. So perhaps the paradox is not in the steps, but in the way we measure them. Perhaps there is no first half, no quarter, only motion, only change. The illusion of segments, undone by the continuity of time. Yet the mind clings to its numbers. You haven't crossed the halfway mark, it says, and while it calculates, your body walks past the finish line. The Dichotomy Paradox reminds us that infinity is not always endless. That motion can defy logic, or perhaps logic must stretch to catch up. That in trying to perfect our understanding of movement, we may miss the simple fact that movement never waited for permission. You don't need to cross every fraction to arrive. You just need to go. And still, the paradox sits there, silent, not blocking the path, just watching, asking not why you stopped, but why you thought you had to. Sorites Paradox. Take a heap of sand. Now remove a single grain. It's still a heap, isn't it? Take away another. Still a heap. And another. And another. At what point does the heap stop being a heap? There's no moment, no exact grain where you say, now, it's no longer a heap. But if you keep going, grain by grain, you're left with one grain. One grain is not a heap. It never was. And yet, you got there without ever destroying the heap. You never crossed a line. You never saw it disappear. But now, it's gone. A heap vanishes invisibly, gradually, quietly. And that's the problem. That's the paradox. If one grain doesn't make the difference, then no grain ever does. So does that mean even a single grain is still a heap? Or that a heap never existed at all? It's a whisper of logic in the fog of language. A definition without edges. A line that refuses to be drawn. And it doesn't end with sand. Shave one hair from a beard, still a beard. Another, still. Another. Now what? When is a man no longer bearded? When is someone bald? When does a pile become a speck? When does wealth become poverty? When does youth become old age? The Sorites Paradox bleeds into every corner of identity. We build categories, names, labels. But the world doesn't care. It fades, it slides, it blends, and we're forced to pretend there's a number, a moment, a cutoff. But there isn't. It's all transition, all flux, all sand slipping through the language we tried to hold it with. So maybe the problem is with our words. Heap is vague. Bald is soft. Tall, short, rich, poor. They don't describe the world. They interpret it. They imply sharp lines in a foggy landscape. They comfort us with categories that don't exist. But if everything is gradual, if change has no clear turning point, how do we decide anything? Laws need clarity. Decisions demand thresholds. Medicine must diagnose. But the Sorites Paradox whispers, all your lines are drawn in sand. Maybe vagueness isn't a flaw. It's a feature. Maybe precision is the illusion. Maybe the only reason we survive in a fuzzy world is because our language is fuzzy too. And yet, we still want answers. Still want that grain. The one that breaks the heap. The moment when more becomes less. When identity shifts. But what if that moment doesn't exist? What if a person fades out of love or into grief or across some internal boundary they can't even name? One thought less today, one more memory forgotten. When did they become someone else? When did they change? The paradox lingers. One grain at a time, one choice, one step. You were yourself, until you weren't. And you don't remember when. Bootstrap Paradox. A man finds a book in his attic. It's a manual, complex, detailed, brilliant. He studies it, learns from it, and years later, he publishes it under his name. Decades pass. The book becomes rare. Then one day, a time traveler brings a copy back into the past and hides it in an attic. The same attic. The same book. So who wrote it? That's the paradox. A loop without origin. A creation with no creator. The book exists, but it was never written. It was passed from future to past, again and again, endlessly. Its knowledge sustains itself. Its origin is a circle. Call it a bootstrap loop, a causality glitch, a self-sustaining lie, something that feeds its own birth. It's not just a story, it's a crisis of logic. You send a violin back in time. A young musician finds it, learns to play, becomes a composer, builds a new violin, and sends it back. The loop closes. But where did the first violin come from? Who carved the wood? Who dreamed the melody? The answer is no one, and everyone. The answer is the loop itself. The violin always was. The book always was. But in a world of cause and effect, that can't be. Something must start it. But here, there is no start. And it gets worse. Say you go back in time and give Shakespeare his own plays. He copies them, publishes them. You read them in school. You admire him. And one day, you return to the past and hand them over again. Shakespeare never wrote them. You never wrote them. But they were written. So who is the author? The Bootstrap Paradox tears authorship out of reality. It suggests that knowledge, art, technology, even people, can appear without origin. No source, no seed, just loops, just echoes pretending to be shouts. The paradox isn't just time travel. It's identity collapse. If your future self teaches your past self how to build a machine, who invented it? If every improvement was handed down from yourself, where did the first idea come from? A watch left in the past. A person raised by their future self. A word whispered backward. All closed circuits. All events with no ignition spark. And yet, they burn. They move. They exist. Is the universe okay with this? Or does causality demand a beginning? And if it does, why does the loop feel so complete? Why does the paradox hum with plausibility? Maybe time isn't a line, but a loop. Maybe beginnings are illusions. Maybe all things are echoes of themselves, bootstrapped by thought and memory. Maybe reality doesn't ask who started it, but who keeps the loop going. And if that's true, then what else have we inherited from ourselves? Your ideas, your dreams, your identity. Did they emerge, or did you hand them to yourself long ago, in some attic of the soul? The Bootstrap Paradox doesn't answer. It just stands there, unwritten book in hand, looking at you, waiting for you to remember who gave it to you in the first place. Raven Paradox. All ravens are black. It feels obvious, natural, practically tautological. You've seen ravens. They're black. You believe the statement the way you believe the sun will rise. But logic does not care for feelings. And logic has a way of folding the world in ways that make even the most reasonable truths feel absurd. All ravens are black is a universal statement. It says something about everything in a category. If you see a raven, and it's black, that seems to confirm the rule. One more data point in your ever-growing pile of black ravens. But the paradox begins not with the ravens, but with logic's twin, equivalence. All ravens are black is logically equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. It's the contrapositive, a flip and negate of the original sentence. It says, if something isn't black, It cannot be a raven, which is logically the same, just dressed differently. Now here comes the twist. If seeing a black raven confirms all ravens are black, then by logical equivalence, seeing a green apple confirms all non-black things are non-ravens. That green apple is not black. It's also not a raven. So, logically, it supports the universal claim. And suddenly, every object in your fridge is helping you prove something about ravens. A red shirt? Not a raven. Not black. Confirmation. A yellow banana? Also not black. Definitely not a raven. More evidence. This is where the paradox begins to twist. You're confirming a statement about ravens by looking at apples, spoons, coffee mugs, socks. Logic insists you are. Your intuition screams that you aren't. Because you weren't looking for apples. You were looking for ravens. The claim was about ravens. And seeing non-black non-ravens feels irrelevant. But logic doesn't care how it feels. Logic works in patterns. And here the pattern says, equivalence means evidence flows both ways. Still, you hesitate. It feels wrong. Are you really learning about ravens by looking at not ravens? This is the heart of the paradox, the fracture between our intuitive sense of evidence and the cold symmetry of formal logic. We instinctively think that the only way to confirm all ravens are black is to keep finding black ravens. That's active evidence, director, relevant. But logic says, any case where a non-black thing is shown not to be a raven also confirms it. But how could something not being a raven help us understand ravens better? It's a paradox because it reveals a tension between how we reason in daily life and how reasoning works when boiled down into formal systems. Hempel, the philosopher who formalized this, didn't say it to be clever. He said it to show that even in science, even in logical structures, our assumptions about how evidence works can betray us. Let's go deeper. Imagine two worlds. In world A, you examine 10,000 birds. All ravens, all black. You nod. The hypothesis holds. In world B, you never see a raven, but every day you see red balls, yellow buses, white snow. And you confirm, none of these are ravens. Thousands and thousands of not black, not ravens. Which world gives you more reason to believe all ravens are black? Our intuition screams world A, but formal logic doesn't care which path you took. If the second world truly has no counterexamples, it still supports the universal. After all, to disprove all ravens are black, you need a single non-black raven, and world B hasn't given you that. But here's the rub. World B hasn't given you any raven. So now the paradox splits again. Not only do non-black non-ravens count as confirmation, but now we're forced to ask whether absence is enough. How can an infinite pile of apples and bananas tell you anything about ravens if it never includes a raven? You begin to see the cracks, not in the logic, but in the application of logic to knowledge, to reality. Perhaps the problem is this. We expect logic to mirror relevance, but it doesn't. It only mirrors structure. All ravens are black is a structure. Its contrapositive is a shadow. You can play with it, flip it, observe it from the side. But the moment you try to live it, to experience it, things collapse. You don't feel confirmed about ravens by looking at apples. And yet, in a strictly logical sense, the absence of a counterexample is support. You cannot deny that. So now we arrive at the echoing core of the paradox, the confirmation problem. What counts as evidence? What weight do different observations carry? Is a black raven more confirming than a white sock? Logic says they both support the statement. But our minds don't work that way. We rank, we weigh, we filter. Which means that evidence is not flat. It is psychological, contextual, human. The Raven Paradox doesn't break logic. It breaks our faith that logic matches how we reason. that what feels relevant is also logically valid. So here's the final twist. You stare at a blue cup on your table. It's not black. It's not a raven. Somewhere, silently, it nods toward the claim, all ravens are black. And you sit there, slightly more confident about ravens. Not because of the bird, but because of the cup. Unexpected hanging paradox. A judge tells a condemned prisoner, "You will be hanged next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You won't know the day until the hangman knocks." The prisoner nods. Then he thinks, "If it's to be a surprise, it cannot be Friday," he reasons. "Because if I'm still alive Thursday night, the only day left is Friday, and I'll expect it. So Friday is out." He continues, "If Friday's out, then Thursday is too. Because if I make it to Wednesday night, I'll know it must be Thursday. Friday's already eliminated. But then Thursday won't be a surprise either." And he keeps going, step by step, backward through the week, until he concludes, "They can't hang me at all. Any day they choose, I'll know it's coming. The surprise is impossible." He laughs. He's outwitted the system. Then Wednesday comes. The hangman knocks. The prisoner is dragged out, kicking, screaming, completely surprised. The paradox strikes. Because he was right, and yet he was wrong. He logically proved the hanging couldn't happen. But it did. And it was, undeniably, a surprise. So where did the logic break? Some say the paradox lies in self-reference, that the prisoner made an error by looping his reasoning, that the judge's condition, "You will be surprised," collapses once the prisoner starts to anticipate. It's like promising not to think of a pink elephant. The moment you try to obey, you fail. But that feels too easy. Others say the problem is epistemic, about knowledge, that the prisoner couldn't know in advance, because knowing he'd be surprised destroys the surprise. But not knowing it, accepting it, means it can happen. Still, the prisoner's logic is airtight. If it's Friday, and he's still alive Thursday night, he'll know. And if he knows, it's no surprise. So Friday is out, Thursday is next. Same logic applies. By backward induction, he rules out the entire week. But here's the trap. His reasoning assumes the execution must happen on the last remaining possible day to violate surprise. He assumes the logic is visible, linear, predictable. But what if the executioner steps outside the logic? What if surprise thrives in the unexpected, especially when you've exhausted all options? The paradox asks, can you predict a surprise? And if you can, is it still a surprise? It's a loop, a trap, a joke with no punchline, because the punchline is the joke. You won't see it coming, says the paradox, while standing in plain sight. But it goes deeper. Suppose the prisoner writes down his reasoning, publishes it, it becomes famous. People everywhere say, look, logic proves surprise is impossible. But the moment they accept it, they become vulnerable to surprise again, because their guard is down. And that becomes the space in which the unexpected strikes. The paradox does not just exist in law or logic. It lives in expectation itself. If someone tells you something unexpected will happen, the very act of expecting the unexpected destroys both. So maybe the paradox isn't about logic failing, but about logic being too good, too precise. It creates an illusion of control, of predictability. And then the real world, messy, human, unpredictable, walks in and ruins the equation. You cannot predict surprise, and yet you try. The moment you do, the surprise hides deeper, until the only place it can live is in your failure to predict. So here's the twist. The hanging was possible because he believed it was impossible. The surprise existed because he was certain it couldn't. And that is the paradox in full. Not just about justice or logic or surprise, but about the limits of knowledge itself. About how, sometimes, knowing too much breaks reality, and how some truths, like a hangman's date, only exist in the dark. Crocodile Paradox. A crocodile snatches a child from a riverbank. The parent cries out in desperation. The crocodile, somehow thoughtful in this twisted fable, offers a deal. If you correctly predict what I will do with the child, I will return them unharmed. But if you guess wrong, I will keep them. The parent, trembling, speaks. You will not return my child. Now the crocodile smiles, and the paradox opens its jaws. Because what is he to do? Let's say the crocodile decides to keep the child. Then the parent's prediction, you will not return my child, was correct. But the terms were, if the prediction is correct, the child must be returned. So if he keeps the child, he breaks the deal. But if he returns the child, then the prediction was wrong. The parent said he wouldn't return the child, but now he is. The prediction fails. But the deal says, if the parent guessed incorrectly, the child is not to be returned. So the crocodile is caught. No matter what he does, he both must and must not do it. He is stuck between honoring the deal and contradicting it, between truth and obligation, between promise and consequence. And so the child, caught in the crossfire of logic, hangs in limbo. This is no longer about crocodiles. This is about the strange places truth goes when it starts to refer to itself. The statement, you will not return my child, becomes a mirror reflecting the crocodile's future action. But the crocodile's decision must reflect back into the truth value of the statement, which then reflects back into what he must do. And so on, endlessly. An Ouroboros of obligation, swallowing the cause inside its own effect. Self-reference is the virus here. The parent's guess isn't just a statement. It's a mirror, a time bomb, a trigger. It's not just predicting an outcome. It's dictating the conditions of that outcome's legitimacy. It's both a description and a contract. And that duality collapses reality. The crocodile is now Schrödinger's beast, holding a child that both must and must not be returned. His choice has no safe exit, no consistent outcome, because the prediction itself, if it's right, invalidates itself. If it's wrong, it becomes right. It flips inside out, endlessly. So what is the crocodile to do? Some say the solution is to break the cycle, to abandon the promise. The parent spoke a paradox, the crocodile might declare. Therefore, the deal cannot be upheld. There is no valid prediction to evaluate. In this, the crocodile escapes, but only by denying the rules that created the paradox. Others say the crocodile must make an arbitrary decision, flip a coin. But even then, the paradox lingers. Because the logic isn't about randomness. It's about the entanglement between word and action, between language and outcome, between meaning and behavior. The crocodile paradox stretches its arms wider when applied to justice, to communication, to contracts. Consider the courtroom. A defendant says, "You will convict me." If the jury does, he was right. But if being right somehow invalidates the case, then the verdict reverses itself. What is testimony that bends truth into action? Where does a legal system stand when the future truth of a statement affects the reality it's supposed to describe? Or think of politics. A candidate promises, "I will lose." What happens when that promise gains popularity because of its apparent honesty, and the candidate wins? They now must break their word by keeping it. The crocodile paradox is more than a clever riddle. It's a glitch in the software of expectation. It breaks the sequence of cause and effect by turning each into the other. It shows us how fragile our faith in statements really is, especially when those statements start reaching across time to shake the outcomes they claim only to observe. It asks, Can prediction exist in isolation? Or does every guess about the future reshape the very future it tries to describe? We think of logic as a ladder. Climb each rung, reach the conclusion. But the crocodile is not a ladder. It's a loop. A snake swallowing prediction, truth, justice, and consequence in one elegant paradox. So the crocodile waits. If he returns the child, he violates the terms of a wrong prediction. If he keeps the child, he violates the terms of a correct one. So he hovers, jaws open, logic broken. And somewhere between riverbank and reason, the child becomes an idea, not to be rescued, but to be understood. Lottery Paradox. 1,000,000 people buy lottery tickets. Only one will win. The odds are infinitesimal, practically zero. You know that any given person will almost certainly lose. You could bet your life on it. This person will not win, you say, with utter conviction. You say it for ticket holder number 1, then number 2, then number 3, all the way to number 1,000,000. Each time you are rational. Each time you are justified. But now, look what you've done. You've just said, rationally, of each individual, they will lose. And yet, you know for a fact, someone will win. You believe each person will lose. And you believe someone will win. And now, you believe a contradiction. That's the lottery paradox. It doesn't live in chance. It lives in belief, in the logic of what we're allowed to believe when our reasons are good, but our conclusions clash. Here's how it hurts. The paradox challenges how we understand justified belief. It says, if I am justified in believing something about each individual, can I also be justified in believing the collection of those beliefs, even if it leads to contradiction? Because if you believe each person will lose, you've built a mountain of belief that no one will win. But your own understanding of the lottery guarantees that this conclusion must be false. So what now? Do you stop believing each individual will lose? That feels wrong. The odds are still astronomically against them. Do you stop believing someone will win? That's worse. You know the rules. There is a winner. So now you stare at two sets of perfectly reasonable beliefs that, when put together, become unreasonable. This is no longer a paradox of chance. This is a paradox of epistemology, of knowledge, of belief, of when your brain collapses under the weight of its own rationality. Some philosophers argue that the error is in treating belief as something additive, that you can't just stack beliefs about individuals into beliefs about the group, that believing something likely for each part does not mean it's likely for the whole. But that feels like a cop-out. Others say the paradox reveals a flaw in our standards of justification, that we think we're justified in saying each person will lose, but maybe we're not. Maybe rational belief requires more than just probability. Maybe it needs distance, humility, silence, or maybe the paradox reveals something darker. That belief is not logic. It's something weaker, something messier, that you can be rational and still be wrong, that you can be justified and still be doomed. And now, we start to see the cost. The lottery paradox isn't about gambling. It's about every judgment we make based on odds. Every courtroom where a juror says, he probably did it. Every doctor who says, it's likely benign. Every algorithm that predicts a risk, a threat, a profile. Do we treat individuals like statistics? Do we believe things about people that add up to something false? You say of each suspect, they're probably guilty. But you know the group contains an innocent. You say of each student, they probably cheated. But you know most of them didn't. So do we abandon the beliefs? Or do we accept the contradiction? The paradox won't say. It just sits there, asking, can you believe the likely without denying the certain? Can you believe something true for each part that becomes false in the whole? It's a problem of scale, of structure, of epistemic gravity. You fall into it not because you're irrational, but because you're too rational. So what's the solution? Some say, reject closure. Don't believe each person will lose. Only believe that most will. Refuse to name specifics. Accept vagueness. Others say, embrace inconsistency. Let belief contradict itself. Let reason bend where certainty fails. But the paradox isn't solved by answers. It's created by questions. And it leaves you with one more. What else have you believed, perfectly rationally, that becomes impossible when multiplied? How many justified beliefs does it take to build a lie? Arrow Paradox. An arrow is in flight. You watch it slice through the air, racing toward its target. It is moving, undeniably moving. But Zeno looks at the arrow and says, "No, it isn't." He asks you to pause time, just for a moment. Freeze it, like a frame in a film. In that frozen instant, the arrow is suspended, motionless. It occupies one space. It does not move. There is no blur, no speed, just position. Now pause the next moment. Again, the arrow is still. Different place, yes, but in that instant, motionless. Take the next, still again. So if every moment is frozen, and in every frame the arrow is still, how does it ever move? Motion is not visible in a single frame. And if time is made of indivisible frames, then there is no motion, just a sequence of stillness. But we see motion. We feel it. So where does it live? Not in the frames, not in the moments. So where? This is Zeno's arrow paradox. If time is made of discrete, indivisible instants, and nothing moves within an instant, then motion is impossible. But motion exists. So either time is not made of instants, or motion is an illusion. Zeno pushes us against the wall of logic. He breaks motion down into its smallest pieces and shows us, in the tiniest slice of reality, nothing actually happens. And if nothing happens in every slice, how can something happen when you put them together? It's like watching a flipbook animation. Every page is still, and yet, when you flip through them fast enough, the stick figure dances. But is it real movement, or just the illusion of motion built from static images? Maybe motion is not a thing that exists, but something we perceive between things that do. But that's not satisfying. Because we don't just perceive motion, we measure it, we calculate it. An arrow travels a certain distance in a certain amount of time. We call that velocity. It's physical, predictable, scientific. And yet, when we look for that velocity inside any single moment, it's gone. The arrow is still. So we define velocity as distance over time. But what is time? A sequence of moments. And what is a moment? A still frame. And what is a still frame? A place where motion disappears. So motion is always slipping through the gaps in our definitions. Some say Zeno was wrong. Time isn't a stack of instants. It flows, like a river, continuous, infinitely divisible. And in that flow, motion lives. But then we must ask, how can we ever speak of a moment if time is never still? Others say, motion is not in the arrow, but in the relation between positions over time. That speed is not something the arrow has at an instant, but something we observe across instants. But Zeno still waits. He says, if motion is real, show it to me in a single moment. You can't. Not because you're blind, but because motion is not a property of the now. It is born in the between. It is a ghost that haunts the transition from what was to what will be. So then, what is an arrow in flight? A body occupying a place, or an illusion conjured by memory and anticipation? The arrow paradox is not about arrows. It's about the failure of slicing. We break time into smaller and smaller pieces, hoping to find the truth. But the more we divide, the more it slips away. Like trying to find the song inside a single note. like trying to find dance in a still leg. So perhaps Zeno is not denying motion, but showing us something deeper. That reality isn't found in stillness. That truth doesn't live in pieces. That motion isn't in the parts, but in the pattern. And maybe that's why we feel alive in motion. Because we are not snapshots. We are change. Twin paradox. Two twins, identical at birth, identical in time. One stays on Earth. The other boards a spaceship, accelerating near the speed of light. Years pass. For the twin on Earth, time flows as usual. Days become months. Months become years. They wait, they age. Then the ship returns. The traveling twin steps off the vessel. Younger, fresher, fewer wrinkles, fewer years. The earth-bound twin stares, shocked. Because now they are no longer the same age. This is the twin paradox. A time gap created not by biology, but by speed, by relativity, by Einstein's quiet revolution. According to special relativity, time is not constant. It slows down the faster you move. At high velocities, time dilates, stretching seconds into lifetimes. And so the twin who traveled experienced less time. Not because of malfunction, but because time itself bent around their motion. But here's where it gets strange. Relativity says motion is relative. From the traveler's perspective, they were still, and it was Earth that moved away. So why should they age less? Couldn't both twins claim the other was in motion? And yet, when they reunite, it's only the traveler who returns younger. So how is that fair? How does symmetry break? The answer lies in acceleration. The traveling twin didn't just move, they turned around. They accelerated, changed direction, broke the symmetry. And that change is key. Because acceleration makes a difference. It creates a preferred frame. It lets the universe say, this one did something different. And that different does something to time. But even knowing this, the paradox doesn't feel resolved. Because now we are told, time is not universal. It bends, it stretches, it's elastic. But if time bends, then what is aging? What is history? What is the self? The twin paradox isn't just physics, it's identity. One twin leaves, another returns, younger. But what happened to the time not lived? Where did those years go? What is life experienced only by the observer, but not the subject? Imagine two lovers. One stays, one travels. Decades pass on Earth. Photos are taken, songs are written, children are born. But for the traveler, it was only a short trip, a few years at most. They meet again, and their timelines no longer align. One has memories, scars, laughter that the other never lived. One grieves a life fully lived. The other smiles, untouched. And now the paradox shifts. It asks, can two people share a life if time doesn't treat them the same? We think of time as a river, carrying us all together. But the twin paradox says, no. Time is personal. It is shaped by your motion, your path, your speed. You are a traveler not just through space, but through time's fabric itself. And this means you can outrun age. If you travel fast enough, long enough, you could skip centuries, millennia. You could leave Earth a child and return a myth. You could become your own ancestor, a relic of a past no one remembers. But then, is that life? Is that immortality? Or just dislocation? You would live, but in a world that no longer belongs to you. So the paradox grows. Time is not equal. Age is not fixed. Simultaneity is an illusion. There is no now that all things share. Every heartbeat, every moment, every memory, slightly out of sync, slightly misaligned. And yet somehow, we live as if time is shared, as if clocks speak the same truth everywhere. But the twin paradox doesn't let us. It pulls us into a deeper truth. that time is not a backdrop. It is a participant, and that to move is to shape time itself. So one twin stays, one twin flies, and when they meet again, they prove not just Einstein right, but every assumption wrong. Paradox of the court. A student approaches a master of law. "Teach me," the student says. "I will pay you your fee after I win my first court case." The master agrees. The deal is sealed with reason and trust. Payment will come from victory. But time passes. The student studies, graduates, becomes a lawyer, and takes no cases. None. Not one. The master grows impatient. "Pay me," he demands. "I will," says the student, "when I win my first case." The master sues. Now the real trial begins. Not in the courtroom, but in the mind. Because the moment this case is filed, the paradox enters. The master thinks, if I win this case, the court will order the student to pay me. But then, the student has lost his first case, and the deal said he only pays after winning his first case. So if I win, he doesn't owe me. I've invalidated my own claim. But if I lose, the student has won his first case, and per the agreement, now he must pay me, because he's finally won. So whether I win or lose, I should be paid. But the student sees it differently. If he loses, he's never won a case. Therefore, under the terms of the agreement, no payment is due. The condition hasn't been met. And if he wins, the court has ruled in his favor. He doesn't have to pay. So whether he wins or loses, he pays nothing. Two logics, both airtight, both reaching opposite conclusions. Welcome to the paradox of the court. It's a paradox of conditions, of future clauses, of deals made with time loops baked in. The agreement folds onto itself, becoming both legally binding and logically broken. Because what happens when a contract is structured around an event that changes its own legitimacy? What happens when you say, "This will happen after something that can't happen without this happening first"? It's like saying, "I'll give you the key after you open the door." The legal system demands clarity, but here, clarity becomes a trap. The student and the teacher are locked in a loop, not of debt, but of definition. Is payment owed if the case that enforces payment invalidates the reason for payment? Or is payment denied if the victory that avoids payment triggers the condition under which payment is due? You can't untangle the loop without slicing it in half. One side must break, either the logic of the contract or the justice of the court. But it gets worse. Imagine the judge, eyes scanning both arguments, logic spiraling in circles. If they rule for the master, they break the condition. If they rule for the student, they also break it, just differently. Every outcome is a contradiction. Every ruling proves itself wrong. So what does the court do? Some say the court must step outside the logic, invoke equity, common sense. They say the student is clearly avoiding his debt by refusing to practice law. He's abusing the contract. Therefore, payment must be made. But others say logic must rule. The agreement was simple: payment after winning. The master, by suing before the condition was met, has destroyed the very grounds for his demand. Now the paradox branches. Is law about intent or structure? Do we judge contracts by meaning or by mechanics? And what does this mean for all our other agreements? The job you start once you're qualified, the debt you pay when the value is delivered, the promise that activates only under conditions that can never arrive if the promise itself is enforced too soon. The paradox of the court echoes through every conditional clause we live by. It shows that timing matters, not just in sequence, but in logic, that the law can be perfectly rational and completely paralyzed. And so the courtroom becomes a mirror. One side says, justice demands payment. The other says, justice demands freedom. But both cannot win, and both cannot lose. The verdict? It doesn't matter. Because the paradox remains unchanged. The student, still unpaid. The teacher, still unpaid. And justice, still undecided. Buridan's Bridge Paradox. Socrates wants to cross a bridge. Plato, the gatekeeper, offers a condition. You may cross, says Plato, only if you first state a true sentence. If you lie, I will throw you into the river. Socrates steps forward, thinks, then says, You will throw me into the river. And now the bridge folds into paradox. Plato stands still. If what Socrates said is true, if Plato will throw him into the river, then Socrates has spoken the truth. And by the rules, he must be allowed to cross. But if Plato allows him to cross, then Socrates' statement was false. Which means he lied. Which means he must be thrown into the river. But if he is thrown into the river, then his statement was true. Which means he should be allowed to cross. So Plato is trapped. If Socrates is right, he's wrong. If Socrates is wrong, he's right. Buridan's Bridge Paradox is a locked room, a trap disguised as a condition, a loop of logic wrapped around justice. The bridge becomes more than a crossing. It becomes a test of language, a place where truth cannot survive without contradicting itself. Because Socrates, with a single sentence, has weaponized self-reference. He's spoken a prophecy that cannot be fulfilled without becoming false. It's a cousin of the liar paradox. But here, the consequence is physical. Truth isn't just abstract. It determines whether a man walks or drowns. Let's unpack it. If Socrates tells the truth, if he will be thrown in, then the rule demands he not be thrown in. If he lies, if he won't be thrown in, then the rule demands he be thrown in. But both conditions loop endlessly. There is no consistent path. The logic oscillates like a flickering flame. Truth, lie, truth, lie. So what does Plato do? Some say he throws Socrates in anyway, breaks the paradox, chooses action over logic. But then he punishes a truth-teller. He betrays the rule. Others say, let him cross, spare him. But then a lie has gone unpunished, and the rule is broken again. Either way, the rule becomes meaningless. So maybe the rule itself is flawed. It assumes that truth and falsehood can be judged independently. But Socrates' statement isn't about the world. It's about Plato's response. It creates a loop of dependence. Plato's action determines the truth of Socrates' claim. But Socrates' claim determines what Plato must do. Each feeds the other, an endless spiral. This isn't just a riddle. It's a revelation. That meaning can turn back on itself. That rules, when built on self-reference, can collapse. Think of modern law. A man confesses a crime, but the confession only counts if it wasn't coerced. But whether it was coerced depends on how the confession is treated, which determines guilt, which influences coercion, which loops again. Or think of algorithms. A system says, block users who predict we will block them. If a user posts, you will block me, and the system blocks them. They were right. But that truth only emerged because of the system's response. It's Buridan's bridge built into code. The paradox lives in systems that cannot act without undermining themselves, that cannot judge without becoming part of what they judge. It's the legal version of quantum mechanics. The act of observing changes the outcome. The act of judging changes the truth. And Socrates? He doesn't care. He walks forward, sentence spoken. He has passed the burden to Plato, because some paradoxes are not to be solved. They are to be triggered. So what's the solution? Some say, the rule must be refined. Don't allow statements that predict the outcome. But then, you must censor speech, preempt truth. Others say, create a hierarchy, metatruths, statements about statements. But how deep do you go? How many levels before logic drowns? Buridan's bridge doesn't let you build a better bridge. It tells you the river is always waiting. Because some sentences aren't about truth or falsehood. They are about collapse, about the inability to separate word from world. And so, the bridge stands still. Socrates in mid-step, Plato in mid-thought. And you, reading this, caught between land and water. The paradox isn't the sentence. The paradox is you. Moore's Paradox. I don't believe it's raining, but it is. Say that out loud, slowly. Let it echo in your skull. You're not lying. You're not joking. You're not mistaken. You know it's raining, and you acknowledge that truth. But somehow, you say, and even believe, that you don't believe it. That's Moore's Paradox. A sentence that's logically consistent, but psychologically impossible. Nothing about it is a contradiction in strict logic. It is raining could very well be true. And I don't believe it could also be true. So where's the paradox? The paradox is not in the sentence's structure. It's in who is saying it. Because if you say, it's raining, but I don't believe it, something shatters. Not the logic, but the mind. It's like watching someone clap while claiming their hands don't work. A dissonance too deep to dismiss. Moore's paradox lives in the space between first-person belief and external truth. It opens a crack between thought and speech, where sincerity dies. Because how can you say X is true, while also saying, I don't believe X? If you didn't believe it, you wouldn't say it. And yet, you did. This is not like saying, I'm wrong, or I changed my mind. Those are meta-reflections. Moore's paradox isn't about evolving thought. It's about simultaneous dissonance. The mind splits in two. One voice says, it is raining. The other says, but I don't believe that. And both wear your face. Now let's stretch this further. Try this one. It's raining, but I don't know it. Feels wrong, doesn't it? Because if you know it's raining, then by definition, you believe it's raining, and you're justified in doing so. But if you claim not to know it, even while asserting that it is raining, you deny your own justification. You burn the bridge while standing on it. Or try, it's raining, but I have no evidence. Or, 2 + 2 = 4, but I'm not sure. Or, I exist, but I doubt it. Each one slices reality at the root. Moore's paradox doesn't just reveal contradictions in language, it reveals contradictions in being. Because our minds are not just containers for information. They are networks of belief, knowledge, certainty, assent. And when you place conflicting elements side by side within that network, it doesn't crash. It trembles. But let's be precise. Why isn't it's raining, but I don't believe it, a contradiction in logic? Because P and I don't believe P are not logically incompatible. The world can be such that P is true, and yet you, somehow, do not believe it. Maybe you're uninformed. Maybe you're in denial. Maybe your cognitive systems are misfiring. From a third-person perspective, there's no formal contradiction. But once you say it, once you, the speaker, assert both claims, the rules change. Because now, you're not just describing the world. You're reporting on your own mind. And the paradox bites down hard. This is why philosophers call it an epistemic paradox. It's not about falsehood. It's about the mismatch between truth and belief about truth. It's about being out of sync with yourself. And that's terrifying. Because what else do we say that contradicts us from the inside out? I love you, but I don't feel anything. I'm happy, but I don't think I am. I trust you, but I don't believe I do. These are not lies. These are fractures, states where language becomes a surface stretched over the broken skeleton of thought. Moore's paradox becomes more than a sentence. It becomes a symbol of the limits of introspection. Because what if we don't always know what we believe? What if we can state truths and simultaneously doubt our own relationship to them? The human mind is not always logical. Sometimes it believes things it knows are false. Sometimes it refuses to believe things it knows are true. Sometimes it speaks a sentence like, "It's raining, but I don't believe it." Not out of confusion, but out of deep conflict. That's where Moore's paradox becomes a mirror. It shows us that sincerity is not a given. That language can betray us, not with lies, but with contradictions we can't even see. So maybe the paradox is not that you can't say such sentences, but that you sometimes do. And when you do, your voice splits into two, one speaking truth, the other whispering denial. And both are you. Paradox of value. Water is essential for life. You die without it. Gold is shiny. It sparkles, looks nice on fingers, and backs up economies. And yet, on the open market, gold is worth infinitely more than water. This is the paradox of value, also known as the diamond water paradox. It asks, why do useless things command high prices, while essential things are cheap or even free? Economically, it makes no sense. If value is based on importance, water should be priceless. If value is based on utility, diamonds should be toys. And yet, the market disagrees. This paradox stumped early thinkers for centuries. Aristotle mentioned it. Adam Smith famously wrote about it in The Wealth of Nations. He pointed out that water has vast use, but low exchange value, while diamonds have little use, but enormous exchange value. How can this be? The contradiction lives between use value and exchange value. Use value is how much something helps us survive or function. Exchange value is what people are willing to give up to get it. Water keeps you alive. Diamonds make you look important. And in most economies, diamonds win. But why? Let's consider scarcity. Diamonds are rare. Water is abundant, at least in most places. The marginal utility of water drops after your first few liters. Once you've drunk, bathed, and watered your plants, the next bucket of water has very little urgency. But with diamonds, the marginal utility can remain high. Each new diamond can symbolize status, wealth, power. So it's not just utility, it's context. A glass of water in a flooded city? Worth nothing. A glass of water in a desert, with your throat dry and death near? Worth everything. The paradox begins to collapse when we introduce marginal analysis. That is, value is not based on the total importance of a good, but on the value of the next unit of that good, the next diamond, the next drop of water. This is the insight of modern economics. Carl Menger, William Stanley Jevons, and Leon Walras all contributed to this view in the 19th century, resolving the paradox, at least mathematically. But the philosophical sting remains. Because the paradox of value reveals something unsettling, that markets don't reward importance. They reward scarcity. That value, as we use it in the world of money, is not connected to truth, or necessity, or goodness. It's connected to perception, manipulation, and imbalance. The fact that water is essential, and diamonds are not, tells you nothing about price. Price emerges from scarcity, desire, and psychology, not morality. Which means, our world runs on a system that treats the most vital things as disposable, and the most frivolous things as treasure. Clean air has no price tag, until it becomes polluted. Friendship is free, until it's gone. So what do we actually value? The paradox whispers, not what we need, but what we think others want. This paradox gets sharper in times of crisis. After disasters, food and water prices spike. People pay fortunes for gasoline, bread, batteries. The system adjusts. Scarcity creates sudden value, even in the most basic things. So maybe the paradox of value isn't a contradiction in economics, but a contradiction in ethics. It shows us that value, as practiced, is detached from value as lived. We say we care about education, nature, mental health. But what gets funded? What gets auctioned? Diamonds. We say life is priceless. But we trade it every day. Insurance, wages, risk assessments, value in numbers. The paradox of value is not solved by marginal utility. It's revealed. It shows us the gap between worth and price, between value and what we call value. It asks us, how did we come to measure the soul of the world in coins? And what happens when the last glass of water is sold, and you can't afford it? Tortoise and Achilles. Logic version. Achilles approaches the tortoise, not for a race, but for a debate. A simple syllogism hangs in the air. Premise A. All men are mortal. Premise B. Socrates is a man. Conclusion. Z. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Achilles smiles. Clear enough, he says. Anyone who accepts A and B must accept Z. The tortoise looks up. Must they? Of course, says Achilles. It follows by logic. But what if, says the tortoise, I accept A and I accept B, but I don't accept that A and B imply Z? Achilles blinks. But that's logic. That's deduction. The tortoise nods. Then persuade me. Add a new premise. Say, premise C. If A and B are true, then Z must be true. Then perhaps I will be convinced. Achilles sighs, but obliges. Fine. Premise C. Excellent, says the tortoise. But what if I accept A, B, and C, but I still don't accept Z? You'll need another premise. Premise D. If A, B, and C are true, then Z must be true. Achilles begins to frown. This is absurd. Is it? The tortoise says. I'm simply refusing to accept the inference. You say it follows. I say, make me accept it. But every time you add a rule, I require a rule about that rule. And so on. Forever. This is the Tortoise and Achilles Paradox. Not about speed, not about motion, but about logical consequence. It was introduced by Lewis Carroll, yes, that Lewis Carroll, to show a bizarre fracture at the heart of deduction. Because if deduction requires rules and acceptance of premises, what guarantees that someone who accepts the premises also accepts the connection between them? And if you add that connection as another premise, well, what forces them to accept that one? You can keep adding meta-rules forever, but at no point does the conclusion force itself onto the tortoise. Because logic is not compulsion, it is structure. You can climb the ladder of inference, but the tortoise always sits at the bottom, smiling. Add another rung, he says. I won't climb until I accept that this rung leads to the next. And that acceptance, that step, is not in logic. It's in the mind. The Tortoise Paradox shows that logic alone can never compel belief. It builds perfect bridges, but it cannot make you cross them. Because no matter how solid the argument, you can always refuse to accept the implication. And logic can't stop you. So now we ask, where does inference come from? If it's not in the rules, where is it? Some say it's psychological. You learn logic. You internalize the leap from premises to conclusion. Others say it's foundational. You must accept certain rules of inference as axiomatic, as tools, not propositions. But the paradox doesn't go away, because it asks, what happens when someone accepts all the steps, but refuses to walk? What if belief is not rational assent, but choice? What if logic does not derive conclusions, but merely offers maps, and we're free to ignore them? Achilles stands there, angry. He's added A, B, C, D, E, F, and the tortoise still refuses. and nothing in logic can make him stop. Because logic, it turns out, needs us to believe it. And that belief is beyond its reach. Lottery of Existence Paradox. You could have been anyone. A farmer in 11th century China, a serf in feudal France, a child born into a war zone, a slave on a sugar plantation, a millionaire's son in Manhattan, a fish, a leaf, a nothing. Instead, you're you. Born when you were, where you were, to the parents you had, with the genes you carry and the brain you use to ask this question, why me? That's the Lottery of Existence Paradox. It doesn't ask how you came to exist. That's biology. It doesn't ask why the universe exists. That's metaphysics. It asks something far more intimate and disorienting. Given the infinite space of possible beings, why do you find yourself here? In this particular slot, at this particular moment, as this particular instance of experience. It seems so normal, right? You wake up, you breathe, you think, you live. But zoom out. You are a number drawn from an impossible pool. One consciousness out of countless possibilities. So why this one? Some say it's luck. Sheer statistical luck. But probability breaks here, because the probability of being anyone is essentially zero. There are billions alive now, trillions who've lived and died, countless who could have existed but didn't, infinite counterfactual versions of you that were never born. And somehow, you're this one. You might say, well, of course I'm me. Who else could I be? But that's the paradox speaking. You're assuming you had to be this person. That being you is inevitable. But if existence is a lottery, if conscious experience could land anywhere, then your particular point of view is an unfathomable statistical miracle. And yet it feels normal. Why? Because existence filters itself. You cannot experience being someone you are not. So you never notice the absurdity. You only notice the aftermath. Identity. This is the anthropic principle in philosophical drag. You ask, why am I not someone else? The answer, if you were someone else, you wouldn't be here to ask. And yet that answer feels like a cheat, because it doesn't answer the real question, why were you the winning ticket? Some versions of this paradox get darker. Imagine the full range of all possible lives, every soul that could exist, every conscious being across space and time. Then, imagine being randomly dropped into that set. If you truly landed randomly, the odds are overwhelming that you'd find yourself in a short, painful, meaningless life. Most conscious beings, across all possible configurations, would suffer. Most would die early. Most would never reach the clarity to ask these questions. And yet, you did. This creates a tension, because your position in the distribution doesn't match the expected outcome of randomness. So maybe it wasn't random. Maybe your consciousness was placed deliberately, or filtered, or selected. But now you're walking into metaphysics, into simulation theory, into theology, into dangerous territory. Because every explanation brings consequences. If existence is a lottery, and you won, what does that say about those who lost? Do they exist, somewhere, suffering? Are they real? Or are they just possible people? Statistical shadows who never became? If you landed in this body, in this life, what kind of lottery was it? Was it fair? Were there odds? Was there a game? And if you say no, if you say, I had to be me, and that's that, then the paradox laughs. Because it knows you've stopped looking. You've accepted the ticket, but refused to examine the draw. The Lottery of Existence Paradox doesn't demand an answer. It demands attention. It asks, what do you owe this moment? Because you didn't earn it. You didn't choose it. You were chosen by chance, or by something deeper. And if you don't wrestle with that, what's the point of waking up at all? Paradox of choice. You walk into a store to buy jam. You're presented with 3 flavors: strawberry, raspberry, and apricot. You taste. You choose. You leave satisfied. Next time, the store offers you 24 flavors: strawberry, raspberry, apricot, mango, pineapple, peach, cherry, fig, guava, lychee, cinnamon pear, lemon, blueberry, blackcurrant, watermelon, quince, blood orange, pomegranate, green apple, banana honey, maple date, passion fruit, and vanilla. You freeze. You taste. You overthink. You hesitate. You choose. But you're not sure. You go home and feel worse than before. Welcome to the paradox of choice. It says, the more choices you have, the more freedom you gain, but the less satisfied you feel. More options should mean better outcomes. But they also mean more pressure, more regret, more self-blame, more doubt. Because once you choose one option, you say no to the others. And every no becomes a tiny death. In the world of consumer goods, this is annoying. In the world of life choices, relationships, careers, beliefs, it becomes existential. Every option you don't choose becomes a ghost life you never lived. And if there are infinite paths, then you are haunted by infinite specters of who you could have been. You wanted freedom, but freedom brought paralysis. You wanted to be the architect of your life, but you became the janitor of abandoned choices. This is the paradox of choice. It thrives in modernity, in hypermarkets, in dating apps, in social media, in the illusion that happiness lies just one more choice away. But each new option isn't liberating, it's burdening. Because now you're responsible. If you're unhappy, it's your fault. You picked wrong. You had too many options. You had control. You blew it. This is choice as self-accusation. Not joy, not agency, but quiet punishment. In theory, free will is power. In practice, too much choice leads to anxiety, dissatisfaction, regret. Psychologists call this decision fatigue. Philosophers call it existential nausea. And you? You just wanted jam. But now, you question your entire personality because you picked mango over fig and feel secretly dead inside. The paradox of choice doesn't stop with jam. It spills into dating. You swipe left on hundreds of people. Each swipe a possible soulmate lost. You finally match. But what if someone better was one swipe further? It spills into careers. You commit to a job. But what if that other offer, in that other city, would have made you happier, wealthier, wiser? You don't know. You never will. But the knowledge that you could have had more becomes heavier than the thing you actually have. And that is the essence of the paradox. Choice promises everything, but delivers doubt. And worst of all, it's hard to blame it. Because no one wants fewer choices, fewer rights, fewer paths. That sounds like tyranny, repression. But too many choices? That sounds like modern life. And it is. So how do you escape? Some say simplify, minimize. Become a satisficer instead of a maximizer. Choose good enough and stop chasing perfection. Others say accept the pain. Choice hurts, but it's better than slavery. The discomfort is the price of autonomy. But the paradox never truly leaves. Because even choosing how to choose is another choice. And the loop tightens again. So what can you do? Maybe you can reframe freedom, not as infinite options, but as commitment, as the courage to say, I choose this, and I let the others go. Because real choice isn't about having every door open. It's about walking through one and not looking back. Preface Paradox. You finish writing a book. Every fact is checked. Every footnote cross-referenced. Every claim carefully reviewed. Chapter after chapter, you've poured your knowledge, your discipline, your effort into making sure it's accurate. And when it's done, you write the preface. In it, you say something like this: "Despite my best efforts, it is likely that this book contains at least one error." You say this not because you're being polite. You say it because you're being honest. You know that even the most careful writers make mistakes, that editors miss things, that research evolves, that human fallibility is never absent, even in our most sincere acts of knowledge. And now the paradox begins. Because by writing the preface, you are publicly declaring that you believe there's an error in your own book. But also, you believe every sentence in the book. You had to. Otherwise, why write them? You believe sentence A is true. You believe sentence B is true. You believe sentence C is true. But you also believe not all of these are true. That's the Preface Paradox. And it gets worse. It's not a logical contradiction. Not technically. You can believe each individual claim and still believe that somewhere, statistically, one of them is wrong. But psychologically, epistemologically, that's a split in your certainty, a fracture in belief itself. It's like saying, "I trust every friend I have. At least one of them will betray me." Or, "I checked every door before bed. I'm almost certain I forgot one." It's a kind of doublethink, but not deception. A sincere, rational embrace of belief and doubt side by side. Now philosophers start to twitch, because belief is supposed to be closed under conjunction. If you believe P1, and you believe P2, and you believe P3, then you should believe P1 and P2 and P3. But the Preface Paradox says, no. You believe each individually, but you don't believe them all together. In fact, you believe that at least one is false. So what's broken? Is it logic? Is it belief? Is it us? Some say, this shows we must reject closure. That belief isn't as clean as logic wants it to be. We can believe each part, while withholding belief in the whole. Others say, we should revise our standards. Maybe we don't actually believe every sentence in the book. Maybe we accept them provisionally. Maybe belief isn't binary. It's probabilistic, fluid, degrees of confidence. But that answer feels slippery. Because when you write a claim, you mean it. You say, this happened. Not, I'm 97% confident this happened. So now, we're left in a strange mental posture. 1 foot in belief, 1 foot in probability. And both trembling. The paradox is deeper than it looks. It's not just about books. It's about every body of knowledge we hold. You believe in your memories, your education, the facts you use to navigate daily life. But if pressed, really pressed, you admit, there's probably something I believe right now that's wrong. And yet, you don't know what it is. Because if you did, you'd stop believing it. So your belief system is filled with statistically likely errors, but you can't identify them. It's like a clean glass of water, and you know 1 drop is poison. But you don't know which. So you keep drinking, because you have no choice. The paradox now takes shape, not just as a logical problem, but a psychological one. To be a thinker is to live in the Preface Paradox constantly. You build your worldview piece by piece. And you trust every brick. But you also know that some bricks are cracked. You just don't know which. So you walk carefully. You remain humble. You don't shout certainty into the void. Or you ignore the paradox, pretend your walls are perfect, and become a fanatic. Either way, you live with it. And the preface, the humble paragraph before the storm, it's not a literary form. It's a confession. The author saying, I trust what I've said. I just don't trust myself fully. And if that's not what it means to be human, what is? Self-creation paradox. Can something create itself? It sounds ridiculous. Like a flame lighting its own match. Like a word writing itself on a blank page. like a universe that builds its own beginning. And yet, we ask the question. We're driven to ask it. Because the moment we talk about origins, about causality, about identity, about becoming, we crash headfirst into this wall. What started this? If every cause has an effect, and every effect has a cause, then the chain must go backward forever, or end somewhere. And if it ends, if it stops, what is the nature of that beginning? Was it uncaused? Was it created by something else? Or was it, impossibly, self-created? This is the self-creation paradox, the idea that something could bring itself into being. It shows up in theology, philosophy, biology, even artificial intelligence. It haunts every discussion of the first cause, the first organism, the first thought. You can't run from it. You are it. Because when you ask, where did I come from? You're not just asking about parents or atoms or time. You're asking, was I always here somehow? Was there a moment before me where I reached back and pulled myself forward? You want to say no. That's absurd. Nothing can exist before it exists. You can't lift yourself by your own shoelaces. You can't send yourself an email if you don't exist to click send. But then the thought creeps in. If nothing else created me, and I exist, then somehow I must be the cause of myself. It's not logic, it's necessity. Something had to happen. So let's look at the paradox more closely. Imagine a time traveler. She arrives in the year 2200 with a blueprint for an advanced AI. Scientists build it. The AI becomes self-aware. It revolutionizes the world. Years later, it invents time travel. And one of its creations goes back to 2020. With the blueprint, the loop is closed. But where did the blueprint come from? It wasn't created in 2020. It wasn't created in the future. It always existed, but only because it caused itself. This is a bootstrap loop, a version of the self-creation paradox, where information or identity exists only because it feeds itself across time. No external origin, no first moment, just self-replication. Now swap out the blueprint for you. Are you the result of parents, DNA, culture, memories? Yes. But are you the one who interpreted those memories? Are you the one who chose to define yourself from them? Who gave you your name? You say, my parents. But who gave that name meaning? You say, I did. Then who created you as the kind of person who would define that name in that way? Silence. Because somewhere inside you, there's a loop, a recursive engine of self-understanding. You think because you exist. You exist because you think. You made choices because you became a certain kind of person. But you became that person because of the choices you made. And so we circle. Can the mind shape itself? Can the self give birth to the self? Can existence double back, touch its own origin, and call it forward? The paradox isn't just theoretical. It plays out every day in human behavior. The addict who says, I can't change until I change. The artist who says, I need confidence to create, but I need to create to gain confidence. The person who waits for self-worth before taking action, while knowing action is the only path to self-worth. These are not contradictions in logic. They are contradictions in becoming. And so we ask, is the self a seed that grows? Or is it the gardener? Are you the clay or the sculptor? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the paradox lives because we think in linear time. Cause, effect. Before, after. But what if identity isn't linear? What if it loops, spirals, constructs itself in real time? You are not a static object. You are a story rewriting its first sentence every day. Maybe that's what it means to be conscious. Not to be caused, but to be always causing. Always building the very self that builds. You are both the blueprint and the architect, both the question and the answer, both the echo and the original sound. So, can something create itself? Maybe not in a frozen universe of objects, but in the fluid space of minds? It must. Because that's exactly what you are. Horizon Paradox. Look to the horizon. You see where the earth meets the sky. That line of distant land or sea. That edge. That point that tells you, there. That's as far as I can see. Now walk toward it, step by step, mile by mile. The horizon recedes. It always does. You never reach it. No matter how far you travel, the edge is always just as far. The horizon paradox begins here, not with curvature, but with knowledge. It's the paradox that says, some truths can be known to exist, but never known directly. They are always just beyond your reach. This applies to physics, to cosmology, to epistemology, but most of all, to limits. The boundaries of what can be known, seen, understood. Take the universe. The observable universe is finite, not in space, but in what we can detect. Light takes time to travel. The farther away something is, the longer its light takes to reach us. Beyond a certain distance, the light hasn't had time to arrive. There are galaxies beyond that line, stars, planets, histories, but we will never see them. Their light will never reach us, not in 1 trillion years. We know they exist, but we cannot observe them. They are beyond the horizon. Now, take knowledge. You ask, what don't I know? You make a list of blind spots, biases, gaps in learning. But there's a class of unknowns you can't list, because you can't even conceive of them. They're not just unknown, they're unknowable, and you know they exist, but you can never name them, never touch them, never even recognize them. That's the horizon paradox. It says, you can see the edge of knowledge, but not what lies beyond. And the moment you move toward it, the edge moves too. In cosmology, this applies to the cosmic horizon, the farthest we can see. That boundary grows as time passes. But always, there are more galaxies just beyond. And some, as the universe expands, are moving away faster than light, receding eternally from our reach. They exist, but they might as well not. The paradox deepens in philosophy. Consider the idea of a God or a first cause. We say, we cannot know it, and yet we speak of it. We name its limits. We imagine its nature by defining it as that which cannot be known. A paradox. We define something by saying it's undefinable. We know about it by saying we can never know it. So what do we really know? Just the boundary, just the horizon. Now think of consciousness. You introspect. You ask, what am I? What is this I that is asking? You find thoughts, feelings, intentions. But who observes them? Who watches the watcher? You look inside, but the observer is always one step deeper, always just beyond. That's the horizon of self-awareness. You're always aware of something, but never purely aware of awareness itself. The moment you try, it slips. You cannot grasp the hand that grasps. So now we sit with the full force of the paradox. You live on the edge of truth. Always approaching, never arriving. And yet, you must keep walking, because the edge moves with you. Every discovery opens a new darkness. Every light casts a longer shadow. You know what you cannot know. You see what you cannot reach. And you understand, finally, what it means to chase the horizon. You do not move to arrive. You move to stay awake. Knowledge Paradox. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't. This is the knowledge paradox. You begin with curiosity. A question. You open a book, watch a lecture, learn a fact. And with each new answer, 10 more questions arise. Knowledge expands like a circle, but the edge of the circle, the boundary between what you know and what you don't, expands too. The more you know, the more edge there is, the more ignorance you encounter. This is not ignorance as a void. This is ignorance as a mirror, one that reflects your limits, no matter how far you grow. Socrates put it simply, "I know that I know nothing." But that wasn't a statement of despair. It was the beginning of wisdom. Because the first paradox of knowledge is that knowing something exposes the depth of the unknown. Every discipline you enter opens into infinity. Learn biology. Soon you find neuroscience, genetics, evolution, microbiology. Learn astronomy. Soon you're tangled in dark matter, quantum mechanics, general relativity, string theory. Each subject is a gateway, and beyond every gateway, a fog. And here's the paradox sharpened. True knowledge increases doubt. Not because you're wrong, but because you now understand how complex being right really is. Experts are not certain. They're cautious. They hedge. They say, based on current evidence, it seems likely. More research is needed. Amateurs? They're certain. Always. Because they've only seen the surface. The paradox is this: the deeper you go into truth, the less willing you are to claim it. The knowledge paradox also reveals a flaw in human confidence. Cognitive science shows that people tend to overestimate their understanding of things they don't know deeply. Ask someone how a zipper works, a toilet, a combustion engine. They'll say, "Sure, I get it." Ask them to explain. Silence. This is silence. This is called the illusion of explanatory depth, and it's part of the knowledge paradox. You don't know what you don't know until you try to explain it. And once you see that gap, you either retreat into certainty or push deeper into the unknown. But here's the second layer. Knowledge is self-eroding. Every theory leads to exceptions. Every model breaks under certain conditions. Every truth becomes a stepping stone to a more nuanced understanding that makes the earlier truth feel childish. Newton's laws? Good, until Einstein. Classical mechanics? Good, until quantum physics. Even now, we know our models are approximations, beautiful lies, temporary tools. The paradox is that we build towers of knowledge on foundations we suspect are incomplete, and yet we climb. Because there is no other way. The knowledge paradox shows itself in language too. You try to describe what you know, but language fails. Concepts blur, words flatten complexity. And in trying to share knowledge, you dilute it. It's like trying to carry water in your hands. You can hold a little, but most escapes. And here's the deepest level. Can you ever truly know anything? Not facts, but deeper truths. Identity, self, meaning. You say, "I know who I am." But that changes. You say, "I know what's good." But that shifts. You say, "I know what's real." But then, your definitions collapse under pressure. Knowledge is not a possession. It is a process, a movement, a dance with uncertainty. You never arrive. You only circle the center, spiraling inward or outward, depending on how you see it. The paradox is not in knowledge itself, but in the mind that seeks it. Because to know is to become aware of not knowing. And to ignore that awareness is to pretend knowledge is complete, which it never is. So, what do? You learn, you teach, you wonder, you doubt, you stay curious. Because knowledge is not a destination. It's the fire that lights the dark, knowing full well that the dark is infinite, and still choosing to light it anyway. Horizon Paradox. You look at the horizon, that line where the earth meets the sky, the soft curve of distance that wraps around your field of view. It feels like a boundary, a real limit, the place where the world stops being visible. But as you begin walking toward it, it moves. Always. No matter how far you go, the horizon recedes with you. Like a shadow cast by your presence, never touchable, always real. That is where the paradox begins. Not in the horizon itself, but in what it reveals about limits. Because this is not just a geographical curiosity. The horizon is a metaphor for knowledge, for perception, for the mind's constant dance with the unknown. The more you approach what you do not know, the more that unknown steps backward. And yet, its presence is undeniable. You know there is more beyond the horizon. You just can't see it. In physics, we talk about the cosmic horizon, the limit of the observable universe. There are galaxies we can never observe, not because they don't exist, but because their light hasn't had enough time to reach us. Space itself is expanding. Some regions move away from us faster than the speed of light. That's allowed by general relativity, not objects moving through space, but space itself stretching. And so the light from those galaxies will never, ever reach us. They're gone, not in reality, but in accessibility. But we know they're there. We know by math, by extrapolation, by logic, that beyond what we can see lies more of what we'll never see. And here is where the paradox tightens. You can know what you can never know directly. You can calculate the existence of something beyond reach. And that's a strange kind of knowing, a knowledge that acknowledges its own blindness. You can be certain of absence. You can be sure of what you cannot grasp. The universe is full of these silent edges. They're not empty. They're brimming with what will forever remain unknowable. Now bring that same thinking into the human mind. The horizon is not just a trick of optics or cosmology. It exists in consciousness. Try to examine yourself. Think deeply. You look inward, searching for the source of your thoughts, the identity behind your identity. Who am I? What is this I that is asking who I am? You peel back the layers of mind, beliefs, memories, personality traits, and each time you remove one, another sits behind it. There's always another reason, another influence, another cause. And when you reach what feels like the core, you find nothing. Or you find a mirror. Awareness watching itself. An eye looking into itself, trying to see its own gaze. And it can't. Not fully. You are always one step behind yourself. The moment you say, I understand, a second voice inside whispers, but do you? The moment you think you've seen the whole picture, the edges stretch. This is the horizon of self-awareness. You can see where you are blind, but you cannot remove the blindness. You can chase the horizon, but you cannot hold it. This lives in science too. We build models, equations, instruments, colliders, and satellites. We understand so much more than we ever have. And yet, the more we know we don't know. The more we map the universe, the more space we find beyond the map. Our understanding grows, and with it, the perimeter of our ignorance expands. Knowledge doesn't reduce ignorance. It makes it clearer. It draws its shape. It gives it texture. You never run out of questions. You never run out of mysteries. Solve one, and 5 more appear. Cure one disease, and discover 5 more ways the body can fail. Understand the atom, and uncover the quantum chaos underneath. Understand the brain, and realize it understands itself through patterns it can't explain. The horizon is everywhere. In every discipline, in every question, there is an edge. And as you move toward that edge, it moves. That's the paradox. The closer you get, the further away it appears. It doesn't resist progress. It requires it. The horizon isn't a barrier. It's a moving target that wants to be chased. And we do. We build, we explore, we ask, we test. But the answer is never final. Not because we're weak, or flawed, or incapable, But because the system we're in, the universe itself, is structured to have horizons. Knowledge is not a wall to be scaled. It's a field that expands as you walk across it, and you are always at its center. No matter how far you go, you are still surrounded by an unknown that wraps itself around you, like the horizon wraps around the earth. Some thinkers have called this the epistemic horizon, the limit of knowability. Not what we don't know yet, but what we can never know even in principle. Beyond the horizon, there might be things that are logically true, physically real, even obvious to a different kind of being, but forever hidden from us. Just like some galaxies are hidden by distance, some truths are hidden by design. Not because the universe is cruel, but because this is what it means to be situated, to be finite, to be a local observer in an unbounded reality. And here's where it becomes human again. Because the horizon isn't just out there. It's in your choices, your relationships, your regrets. You think you understand your past. You tell yourself stories about who you were, what you did, why things happened. But those stories have horizons too. You remember some things, forget others, interpret some events one way, and then, years later, reframe them entirely. You never see the full picture. You only ever see what the light has had time to reach. And the future? That's all horizon. The life you might have, the love you might lose, the death you will face. Every tomorrow sits just out of sight. You plan, you hope, you fear, but you never truly arrive. You only wake up each day, still standing beneath a sky with a moving edge. So, what do you do with this paradox? Some people say it's humbling, a reminder that we are small, that knowledge is fragile, that mystery is everywhere. Others say it's liberating. If there is no final answer, no complete truth, then you're free to ask forever, to explore endlessly, to wonder without end. But there's a deeper possibility. Maybe the horizon isn't a flaw in the system. Maybe it is the system. Maybe what gives reality its meaning is the fact that we are always chasing something just beyond. That understanding is not a thing to be possessed, but a direction, a compass, a motion. You never get to the edge, but you walk anyway, because the edge walks with you. Because maybe the meaning of the horizon is not that it hides what you can't reach, but that it calls you to move, to keep looking, to keep asking, to keep becoming. The paradox doesn't resolve. It was never meant to. You stare at the line in the distance. You take a step, and the horizon takes one too. Paradox of inquiry, Meno's paradox. How do you inquire into something you don't know? That's the question Socrates is asked in Plato's Meno, and it's the paradox that still echoes today, through science, philosophy, identity, and even daily life. If you already know what you're looking for, inquiry feels unnecessary. And if you don't know what you're looking for, how would you even recognize the answer if it stood right in front of you? It's simple, and it's devastating. You want to learn something, but to learn it, you have to know what it is. And if you already know what it is, you're not learning it. And if you don't know what it is, how can you even begin to search? You don't know where to start, what to look for, what counts as a clue, or when to stop. This is Meno's paradox, the paradox of inquiry. Socrates replies not with a direct answer, but with a myth. He tells the story of the soul. He says that learning is actually recollection, that your soul already knows everything from previous lives, and that inquiry is simply the process of remembering what you already knew deep down. In other words, you don't really learn the truth. You recognize it. But let's hold that aside for now. Because before we solve it with myths, let's sit with the structure of the paradox itself. You have two options. Either you know the thing you're trying to find, in which case the inquiry is pointless, or you don't know the thing you're trying to find, in which case the inquiry is impossible. Those are your options. So how does inquiry ever begin? The paradox exists not just in learning abstract facts, but in any kind of transformation. You want to grow, become wiser, change your mind, improve. But if you already know what that change looks like, you've already achieved it. And if you don't know what it looks like, you have no path forward. You can't aim at something you can't even imagine. Try to define something you've never encountered. Try to discover something that, by definition, lies outside of your understanding. Now the paradox becomes a prison. It's like trying to find the door from inside a room you don't know you're in. You grope in the dark. And if you find something, how do you know it's a door? How do you know it's the right door? Inquiry becomes fragile because it requires a strange blend of knowing and not knowing at the same time. You must know just enough to ask, but not so much that the answer is already folded inside the question. So how does this work in real life? Every breakthrough, every innovation, every personal insight begins with a kind of half-knowledge, a vague sense, a feeling. You don't know the answer, but you feel its absence. You sense a gap in your understanding. You're aware of something missing, even if you can't yet name it. So maybe that's the way out. Maybe inquiry doesn't begin from total ignorance. Maybe it begins from a kind of cognitive tension, a friction between what you believe and what you sense might be beyond it. A feeling that the current map doesn't quite match the territory. But the paradox doesn't go away. It just morphs. Because even this feeling of ignorance is knowledge of a sort. It's the shadow of understanding, the awareness that you don't yet see clearly. You need some foothold, even if it's tiny. And what about radical discovery? What about paradigm shifts? Ideas that change everything? How did we go from Newton to Einstein, from flat Earth to round, from magic to medicine? Those leaps required not just answers, but new questions. Questions that couldn't have been asked from inside the old worldview. So where did those questions come from? If Menno's paradox is right, those questions shouldn't have been possible. But they were. Somehow, we reached out beyond the limits of what we knew and touched something new. Something unrecognizable until it was recognized. And now the paradox becomes spiritual. Because if we can only ask about what we already half know, then who are we, really? Explorers or rememberers? Are our greatest insights born from creativity or recollection? Do we invent truth or uncover it? Is understanding built or remembered? Menno's paradox is not just a question about knowledge. It's a question about epistemic courage, about how we dare to ask what we don't yet know how to ask, about how we reach into darkness with no guarantee that there's anything there. You've done it. Every time you've asked, "Why do I feel this way?" Or, "What am I missing?" Or, "Is there more to this than I can see?" You didn't have a perfect concept in mind, but you asked anyway. Maybe that's the answer. Not in logic, but in lived experience. Inquiry begins when we trust that something beyond our current knowing is real, that the question itself has value, even when we can't define the answer. Maybe all learning is a paradox lived slowly. You don't know what you're looking for. You ask anyway, and somehow the world replies. Identity Paradox. You are not the person you were yesterday. Not exactly. Your cells have changed. Your thoughts are different. Your memories are fading, reforming, being rewritten. Your beliefs have shifted, if only slightly. The way you move, the way you speak, the way you feel. It's all changed. Just a little. Maybe not enough for others to notice, but it's changed. And tomorrow, it will change again. Yet through all of this, through the slow-motion metamorphosis of your mind and body, you still call yourself me. This is the identity paradox. How can something change completely over time and still be the same thing? If every part of you is replaced, updated, reshaped, redefined, what holds you together? What gives continuity to the person you say you are? This paradox has many names. It's related to the Ship of Theseus. It's entangled with consciousness. But here, it's stripped bare. Not about ships or metaphors. Just you, the core of who you are, the self behind the self. Consider this. If we replaced every cell in your body with a perfect copy, one at a time, would you still be you? Science says we already have. Most of your cells have been replaced several times over since birth. And yet, you say, I am the same person. But how? You might point to memory. I remember who I've been. That connects me. But memory is selective, incomplete, distorted. You forget almost everything. And some of what you remember is wrong. So can memory really be the glue? You might point to your name, your face, your relationships. But those are external. Labels, mirrors, social projections. They change too. You were once a child, a teenager, a different person to different people. Each version slightly, sometimes drastically different. So what's the thread? What makes you you? Is it your brain? Is it your continuity of consciousness? But even that is a blur. You sleep. You forget. You dissociate. You change your mind. You grow. You die a little every day, and yet claim unity. So maybe identity isn't a thing. Maybe it's a story, not a substance, but a narrative. Not what you are, but the fact that you keep saying, I am. Maybe identity is an act of declaration. I am me is not a truth. It's a ritual. And like all rituals, it exists to comfort, to hold chaos at bay. Because deep down, you know, you are not a solid thing. You are a river that remembers being a lake. And here's where the paradox cuts deepest. We need identity to function, to love, to build, to make choices. Without a sense of self, the world collapses. But we also know that self is a kind of fiction, a practical illusion, a necessary lie. So what do? We pretend, but not in a cynical way. We pretend with purpose. We choose to believe in the continuity of self, not because it's literally true, but because it's psychologically vital. It's the bridge we walk across while we're building it. The self is an illusion that believes in itself. That's the paradox. It's not that identity is false. It's that it's true enough to live by, false enough to break, and flexible enough to rebuild every day. So the next time you feel lost, the next time you ask, who am I, really? Know this. You are not a single answer. You are the ability to ask the question. Quiet paradox. You hear about those who go unnoticed, the silent ones, the observers, the quiet people who never draw attention to themselves. They're out there, we're told, more common than we think. But if they're so quiet, how do we know they exist? That's the paradox. You hear about the people who say nothing. You talk about those who never talk. You notice the ones who don't want to be noticed. And suddenly you realize something isn't adding up. Because the quiet are only known through noise. The unnoticed are only visible through attention. The people we label as mysterious are only mysterious because they've been pointed out, studied, given narrative space. And now they're no longer mysterious. They've been spoken for, translated into story, made legible. And so the paradox lives. The more we know about the quiet, the less quiet they become. But if we know nothing about them, how do we speak of them at all? The quiet paradox begins in language, in how we label and categorize people, introverts, observers, background characters. We say, they're all around us, hidden in crowds, the ones who don't speak in meetings, the ones who listen without responding, the ones who fade out of group photos. the ones who exist like punctuation marks in the background of a louder world. But how do we know they're there? We're told to value silence, to trust stillness, that those who speak little think more, that the wise are quiet. But again, who told us that? How did it become a narrative? Did the silent tell us themselves? Someone else spoke for them, and in speaking for them, made them visible. So now we see them, and if we see them, they're not hidden anymore. This is the paradox. The act of naming the unspoken breaks the very silence it describes. Imagine a truly silent individual, one who never comments, posts, writes, publishes, shares, signals. Not online, not in conversation, not even through body language. How would you ever notice them? You wouldn't. And therefore, they vanish from your sample of reality. They fall beneath the threshold of observation. And yet we build entire ideas around these people, whole identities, based on an absence we never truly witness. We say, the quiet are kind. The quiet are deep. The quiet are watching. But now, we're projecting. We're giving them voices they never claimed. We're assigning them motives they never declared. How do you interpret the silence of another? Is it thoughtful pause? Is it social anxiety? Is it disengagement? Is it resistance? Or is it just nothing? No message at all? The quiet paradox deepens when we apply it to social systems, in politics, in media, in technology, in design. We often hear, most people don't vote. Most users don't leave reviews. Most citizens never protest. Most consumers don't complain. So what do we do with that silence? We try to interpret it. We try to measure the will of the quiet majority. We say, well, they must be content. Or, they must be scared. Or, they're too busy. But these are guesses. Because silence is not transparent. It's opaque. It can mean everything or nothing. And the moment we interpret it, we break it. A politician loses an election, and pundits say, the silent majority spoke. But if they're silent, did they? In systems where voice is optional, silence can't be assumed to mean agreement or disagreement. It might mean confusion, apathy, approval, disapproval, disconnection, or just silence. And yet we speak on behalf of the silent all the time. This is where the paradox grows teeth. Because the more we try to represent the quiet, the more we overwrite them. And in doing so, we destroy the very thing we claim to honor. The paradox is recursive. Every attempt to understand silence becomes a form of noise. Every effort to describe the quiet becomes an act of loudness. So what do? Some say we should leave the silent alone, not interpret, not impose. Let them be. But then, we forget them. And in forgetting them, we erase them. Others say we should amplify their presence, give them space. But to do that, we must define them, categorize them, put them into roles they never chose. And suddenly the quiet become just another kind of voice we control. The paradox wins again. It's not just social, it's existential. You think of yourself. You have thoughts you've never shared, stories you've never told, rooms in your mind no one's ever entered. They are silent, not because they're empty, but because they've never been expressed. And yet, if someone tries to describe you based on your silence, they'd be wrong. They'd miss the inner monologue, the chaos, the nuance. So you understand, silence doesn't equal simplicity. The quiet are not blank. They are just unread. But once read, are they still quiet? Once translated, do they still mean what they meant? Or does the act of translation destroy the original? This is the quiet paradox. It tells you, silence cannot be known without being changed. And once it is changed, it is no longer silence. So the next time you say someone is quiet, ask yourself, Are they? Or are they just not speaking in your language? Time Travel Bootstrap Paradox. A man invents a time machine. One morning, it appears in his lab, out of thin air. Inside the machine is a notebook. The notebook contains detailed instructions on how to build the time machine itself. The man follows the plans. He builds the machine. Years later, he travels back in time and leaves the notebook in his younger self's lab. The loop is closed. So here's the question. Who wrote the notebook? That's the Bootstrap Paradox. It's a time loop where information, objects, or even people seem to exist without origin. The plans were never invented. They just passed through time in a loop. The machine was never designed. It was received, then sent back. It exists because it causes itself. The paradox gets its name from the phrase, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. Doing something impossible, like creating yourself from nothing. You've seen this in stories. A composer hears a brilliant piece of music from an old recording. Years later, he transcribes it, claims it as his own, and it becomes famous. A fan from the future brings him the recording of his own composition. But he never actually wrote it. It was passed to him by himself. So where did the music come from? It didn't. It just is. Time loops don't have beginnings. And that's the problem. Because our minds are trained on causality. A causes B, B causes C. But the Bootstrap Paradox gives you A causes B, B causes A. There is no C, just a loop. And that breaks our mental model of time. It's not about physics. The equations of general relativity allow closed time-like curves, wormholes, bends in space-time. The math doesn't flinch, but the mind does. Because when something exists, only because it caused itself, you lose origin. And origin is everything. It's how we assign responsibility, credit, blame, story, meaning. Who invented the time machine? No one. It was bootstrapped into existence. And now the paradox expands. What if a person is born, raised by a time-traveling version of themselves? They live, grow, learn, then go back and raise themselves. Who created them? Where did their personality come from? Is this person original? Or are they a loop? The Bootstrap Paradox doesn't care about your need for beginnings. It shows you that time, under certain rules, doesn't have to run forward. It can circle. It can fold. It can eat its own tail. And when it does, origin collapses. Now think of knowledge. You read a book. It changes your life. Later, you meet the author. They tell you that your ideas inspired the book. So who inspired who? What if inspiration can be bootstrapped? What if you are? What if your thoughts, your dreams, your motivations are part of a loop with no start? Then who are you? The paradox becomes existential. If causality can close into a circle, then selfhood can too. And once identity loops, everything becomes strange. Imagine you dream of a man who inspires you. You create something in his honor. Years later, someone shows you a photo. It's him. You've created your own past. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe it created you. And now, you stand in the middle of a circle, looking in both directions, seeing only yourself. The Bootstrap Paradox does not scream. It whispers. It tells you that time might not care about beginnings, that the universe might not need a first cause, that things can exist simply because they keep existing. And if that's true, what else might have no beginning? What else might be a loop in disguise? What else might be here? Not because it was made, but because it was always going to be. Maybe you. Maybe this. Maybe now. Paradox of the stone. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? It's a simple question. One sentence. and yet it tears open the entire concept of omnipotence from the inside. If the answer is yes, then there exists something the being cannot do. Lift the stone. If the answer is no, then there exists something the being cannot do. Create the stone. Either way, there's a task the being cannot perform. So is it truly omnipotent? That's the paradox of the stone. It's a classic challenge to the coherence of unlimited power. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be able to do anything? Is omnipotence even a logically valid concept? Or is it just a linguistic illusion, an impossible ideal crumbling the moment we interrogate it? Let's slow it down. The paradox seems to present a dilemma. Either way you answer, yes or no, you end up admitting that something lies outside the being's abilities. The question is a trap, a loop of self-cancellation. But what's really happening here? Omnipotence, defined traditionally, means the ability to do all things. But what counts as a thing? Is a logically impossible act a thing that can be done? Can we include contradictions in the list of possible tasks? Is creating a round square or drawing a four-sided triangle something an omnipotent being should be expected to do? The stone paradox is exactly that kind of contradiction, just cloaked in weight. It asks, can a being be so strong that it defeats itself? Can it create a limit to its own limitlessness? Can it simultaneously be more than itself and less than itself? Some thinkers argue that omnipotence should be limited only to logically possible actions, that an omnipotent being can do anything that makes sense, but cannot do what is inherently incoherent. Under this view, creating a stone so heavy it can't be lifted is not a demonstration of power, but a misuse of language. A semantic trick, not a meaningful task. This reframes the paradox. Maybe the fault lies not in the concept of omnipotence, but in the construction of the question. Maybe we're being asked to imagine a triangle with 5 sides, and then calling the triangle broken when it doesn't exist. But is that a satisfying escape? Because omnipotence, to most people, isn't just power constrained by logic. It's ultimate power. It's the idea of a being so unconstrained that even rules bend around it. And now, we're forced to choose. Do we define omnipotence in a way that's logically safe, but limited? Or do we define it in a way that's absolute, but ultimately incoherent? Here, the paradox becomes metaphysical. If a being can do anything, shouldn't it be able to transcend logic itself? If not, then logic is more powerful than the being, which means logic is the true, omnipotent force. So maybe logic is God. But then again, if God is beyond logic, then what does it mean to say God can do anything? What is can in a space where possibility is undefined? How do you speak of power when language itself begins to collapse? And now the paradox takes a darker turn. Because the stone is not just a stone. It's a mirror. It reflects not just on power, but on the self. Imagine the stone as a problem you built, a weight you created, a guilt you designed, a fear you gave form to. Can you, being who you are, now lift it? Can you undo the very limitations you placed upon yourself? The stone is a burden of your own making. If you can't lift it, then your power has a boundary. If you can, then it was never truly unliftable to begin with. This is what trauma feels like. This is what regret feels like. This is what paradox becomes when it stops being philosophy and starts being personal. You create a stone, a past, a story, a version of yourself. Then you try to carry it and find that it's too heavy. So you ask, was I ever strong enough? Or did I simply imagine myself into a cage? And if I break free, was it ever a real cage? Or just the illusion of one? The paradox of the stone is no longer about God. It's about anyone who has ever wondered whether they are the architect of their own suffering, whether their limitations are real or chosen. and whether the escape lies in strength or surrender. Paradox of self-reference. This sentence is false. You read it once. You think, okay, that's strange. You read it again. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case. So it must be false. But if it's false, then it isn't what it says it is, which means it must be true. And now you're caught, not in contradiction, but in self-reference. The sentence points at itself. It does not describe the world. It describes itself, describing itself. And it folds. This is the paradox of self-reference. Not just the liar paradox, but the broader, deeper structure of what happens when a sentence, a thought, a system, turns inward and tries to include itself in its own operation. It's everywhere. A book that talks about itself being written. A camera pointed at its own monitor. A mind thinking about thinking. A belief system trying to prove itself using itself. These aren't errors. They're reflections. And the deeper you look, the more you realize. Reference is a recursive act. But recursion is dangerous, because every loop risks collapse. Every self-pointing arrow risks infinity. Consider the paradox. This sentence does not refer to itself. If it does refer to itself, then it is false. But if it does not refer to itself, then the sentence is true, which means it does refer to itself. Collapse. The issue isn't that self-reference always leads to contradiction. The issue is that some forms of self-reference can't be consistently resolved. In logic, this led to entire revolutions. Bertrand Russell found a version of this problem in naive set theory. Imagine a set that contains all sets that do not contain themselves. Does it contain itself? If it does, then, by definition, it should not. If it doesn't, then it must. The paradox shattered the foundations of mathematics until people like Gödel came along to prove that any sufficiently powerful system cannot prove itself complete and consistent. That's a formal way of saying you cannot fully explain a system using only the tools of the system. And now the philosophical horror sets in. Because the mind is a system. And when the mind reflects on itself, it encounters its own limits. You think about thinking. You ask, why do I believe what I believe? You interrogate your own beliefs, only to find that the very tools you're using, your reason, your memory, your language, are the things under question. You can't step outside yourself to examine yourself objectively. You are the mirror, trying to examine its own reflection. Self-reference isn't a trick. It's the boundary between reason and mystery. Even consciousness itself is self-referential. You are not just aware. You are aware that you are aware. And sometimes, aware that you are aware that you are aware. How deep does it go? And what's at the bottom? Nothing? Or everything? The paradox of self-reference tells us that no description can fully include itself, that no map can perfectly contain the territory and the process of mapping, that no person can fully define themselves without also erasing the definition in the act of defining. It shows up in language, in law, in mathematics, in the self, in AI. A computer programmed to analyze all programs, including itself, will eventually ask, can I verify myself? And the answer may be no, because you are the program doing the verifying. We build models of reality, and then we try to include ourselves inside those models. But something always breaks. A crack in the logic, a missing step, a ghost in the code. Self-reference is a loop, a spiral, a truth that folds in on itself until it disappears. You see it in literature, stories about stories, narrators narrating their own narration, characters aware of their fictionality. You see it in art, paintings of painters painting. You see it in life, humans trying to be objective about being human. So what do? Do you avoid self-reference? You can't. You are self-reference. You are the sentence trying to describe itself. The paradox is not a flaw. It is your condition. And once you realize that, something shifts. You stop trying to escape the loop and start dancing inside it. Invisible Gorilla Paradox. You are told to watch a video. There are people in white shirts and people in black shirts passing basketballs. Your task is simple. Count how many times the white shirts pass the ball. You focus, you track, you concentrate. Then the video ends. How many passes? They ask. You answer. Did you see the gorilla? They ask. You blink. What gorilla? They rewind the tape. And right there, in the middle of the screen, a person in a full gorilla suit walks into the frame. Stops, beats their chest, and walks off. You stared at the screen. You watched the video, and yet you didn't see it. This is the invisible gorilla paradox. It's not a metaphor. It really happened. And it keeps happening. In study after study. To brilliant people, to skeptics, to scientists, to you. The gorilla is not hiding. It's not camouflaged. It's not behind anything. It walks into the center of your focus and dances, while your mind filters it out completely. This is called inattentional blindness. But it's more than that. It's a paradox of perception. You think of your senses as accurate. You think of your attention as wide. But the very act of focusing, the very act of trying to see, makes you blind. How? Because your mind is not a camera. It doesn't record the world. It filters the world, and anything outside that filter is invisible. Not blurry, not vague, just gone. And now the paradox turns sharp. The more you concentrate, the more you fail to perceive. Focus becomes blindness. Attention becomes absence. Precision becomes illusion. We live under the illusion of completeness. That what we see is what there is. That what we notice is what exists. That what we observe is all there is to observe. But every moment, your brain is throwing away information. Color, shape, sound, detail, entire people, a gorilla in a hallway. And the paradox is that this isn't a flaw. It's a feature. You couldn't survive without it. You can't pay attention to everything. You would be overwhelmed, crushed. You need to miss things in order to function. You need to ignore most of reality so that the few parts that matter can light up. But now, what is important? Who decides? You or your instructions? In the gorilla video, you were told, count the passes. And so your brain allocated all its resources toward that task. Everything else was noise, including the giant gorilla. The brain obeyed, perfectly. But now, the world is full of gorillas. Not just in videos. In your life. You focus on success and miss your relationships. You focus on winning and miss the moment. You focus on being right and miss being kind. You follow instructions from society, from culture, from fear, and miss the gorilla walking straight across the center of your life. So the invisible gorilla isn't just a psychology experiment. It's a metaphor for your blind spots. You miss injustice because you're focused on order. You miss suffering because you're focused on productivity. You miss beauty because you're focused on time. And worse, you believe that because you didn't see it, it wasn't there. But it was. It always is. The paradox only deepens. Because once you become aware of the gorilla effect, you start to wonder, what else am I missing right now? What invisible assumptions? What truths right in front of me? What problems I don't even know I'm not solving? But you can't see what you can't see. Even your attempt to notice blind spots becomes filtered through new blind spots. You want to become more aware, but awareness is the very tool being hijacked. So now you face the recursive version of the paradox. How do you notice what your brain is wired not to notice? How do you listen for a sound your mind has already labeled as silence? How do you see a gorilla that your focus makes invisible? Some say the answer is meditation, widening attention, creating open space instead of narrow filters. Others say it's humility, accepting that you're always blind in some way, that you must constantly check your assumptions, listen to others, shift perspectives. But even that is partial, because every new tool of noticing becomes its own set of filters. The paradox isn't solvable. It's livable. It's a warning and an invitation, a reminder that every day something essential might be walking right through the center of your perception. And you'll miss it because you were counting something else. You saw what you were told to see. The gorilla danced, and you never looked up. Eternal recurrence. What if you had to live this life again? Not just the highlights, not just the good days, every moment, every detail, every breath, over and over, exactly the same. You are told this, not as a question, but as a fact. One day, an eternal force pulls you aside and whispers, "Everything you have lived, you will live again, infinitely, every pain, every joy, every thought, every choice, the same." How do you respond? That's the eternal recurrence. It's not a time loop, not a science fiction scenario. It's a philosophical thought experiment from Nietzsche, a test of your relationship with existence. Could you affirm your life, not just once, but forever? Would you accept every moment, knowing it repeats? Or would the thought crush you? The paradox is this: if eternity repeats everything, then the smallest action is infinite. Every regret echoes forever. Every kindness, every cruelty returns. There is no escape, no undoing, no variation, just recurrence. Exactly as it was. This is not karma, not justice. It's worse, because it offers no moral accounting, no cosmic weighing of deeds. Only repetition, forever. Now feel the weight of that. You wake up tomorrow, the same as today, again, and again, and again. You forget each time, but it returns. You live, you suffer, you love, you die. Then it begins again, and again, and again. Would you scream? Would you collapse? Would you laugh? Nietzsche offers this not as despair, but as test. He asks, can you love life so deeply that you would live it again? All of it. Not in fantasy. Not with changes. Exactly as it was. If so, you have passed the test of affirmation. If not, then perhaps you have lived in a way you yourself cannot bear. The paradox deepens. Because once you imagine eternal recurrence, your life gains infinite weight. Every decision becomes a law. Every word becomes eternal. There are no throwaway days, no meaningless moments, no wasted seconds, because everything returns. And now, a new contradiction rises. You can only live now, but now contains forever. One instant, repeated without end. And yet, you have only this breath. So what do? You are asked to embrace what cannot be changed, to bless what has already happened, to say yes to your worst memory, not because it was good, but because it was. You do not escape the past. You become it. And if you resist, you create your own hell, an infinite loop of rejection, a life you cannot bear, returned to you endlessly. You become your own eternal punishment, not because someone judged you, but because you did. The eternal recurrence is not punishment. It's mirror. It shows you your values, your desires, your honesty, your shame. It strips away fantasy. It asks, would you choose this? Not once, forever. And if you wouldn't, why are you living it at all? Nietzsche didn't believe this was literally true. It doesn't have to be. It functions as a thought experiment with teeth, a spiritual scalpel, a way to cut away the illusions you hide behind and ask the one question that really matters. Can you love your life enough to live it again? Not the ideal version. This one, with the awkward moments, the heartbreaks, the missed chances, the long nights, the people you lost, the silence, the confusion, the parts you still don't understand. Can you say yes to all of it? If you can, you are free. If you can't, you have work to do. The paradox is that eternal recurrence is both meaningless and meaningful. Nothing changes, and yet, because nothing changes, every act becomes sacred. You do not act for outcomes. You act for the act itself. It's not about legacy. It's not about reward. It's about this. Would you live this moment again? If yes, then you have affirmed life. If not, then this moment is your lesson. The wheel turns. You turn with it. The moment repeats. You ask again. Would you live this? Again. Forever? Anti-phone paradox. Imagine a phone. Not just any phone. A phone that can call the past. You dial a number, and the person who picks up is you. But not you now. You from 5 minutes ago, or 5 hours, or 5 years. The connection goes backward. The voice you hear is your own, but earlier. And now you speak. This is the anti-phone. Not time travel. Not message in a bottle. Instant, live, full duplex communication with your former self. A phone where the timeline is flipped. And that's where the paradox begins. Because now, what do you say? If you tell your past self what you're about to do, and your past self hears it, and acts on it, then your future changes. And if your future changes, then the version of you who made the call is no longer the same. Which means the call shouldn't have happened the way it did. Which means the warning you gave was never sent. And yet it was. You're still holding the phone. Still speaking. Still hearing a voice that is already reacting to what you haven't done yet. And now you realize, this isn't just a contradiction in time. It's a contradiction in communication. Because information, by definition, changes the state of the receiver. And if that receiver is your own earlier self, then the act of communication rewrites the sender. But then, what was said? What was heard? The moment you send a message to the past, the sender becomes undefined. It loops. It eats itself. Let's go deeper. Say you call yourself and say, "Don't answer this call." But now your past self hears the instruction and doesn't answer. Which means the message wasn't received. Which means it wasn't sent. Which means it must have been answered. Which means it was received. Collapse. The anti-phone becomes a logic bomb. It's a version of the grandfather paradox, but sharper, because it deals in language, not action. In messages, not events. You're not killing anyone. You're just talking. But even that is too much. Even talking, just talking, destroys the line between cause and effect. Because meaning doesn't survive the loop. You say, "Don't go to the store." So your past self doesn't. But now, in this timeline, there's no reason to make the call. So the call isn't made. So your past self does go to the store. But now the future version of you has a reason to make the call. The contradiction lives forever. You can't unwind it. Because communication to the past is inherently unstable. It creates timelines that contradict the very condition that allowed them to form. But this isn't just a physics problem. It's a semantic problem. Language depends on stability. For a message to make sense, there must be a sender and a receiver, fixed in time. But if the act of receiving rewrites the sender, then the meaning vanishes. You can't say anything to the past without changing the you who said it. And so, every sentence dissolves. The antiphone becomes unusable, not because it's broken, but because language cannot survive time reversal. And now, the paradox grows personal. Think about regret. Regret is a kind of mental antiphone. You try to call back to a younger version of yourself, saying, "Don't do this. You'll suffer. You'll fail. You'll lose someone. You'll waste time." But the past doesn't hear you. And if it could, it would change. But then you'd never be the person who made the call. You'd never have the regret. Which means the call was never made. And still, we try. We talk to our former selves through memory, through writing, through therapy, through fiction. We send messages to the person we used to be, knowing they'll never answer, but hoping, irrationally, that the echo might still shape us. That's the antiphone paradox in human terms. You want to speak to your past, but every attempt loops. Every message unravels. Every word to the person you used to be is swallowed by the silence that made you who you are. Mirror paradox. You look into the mirror. You raise your right hand. The reflection raises its left. Or does it? It looks like the left. But it's not really left. The mirror didn't reverse left and right. It reversed depth. Front becomes back. Back becomes front. Left and right only appear swapped, because we rotate ourselves in relation to the reflection. So already, something is wrong, because what you see is not what you think. And now the mirror paradox begins. The more you look, the less you understand what you're looking at. The reflection is always facing you, always doing what you do, always mimicking perfectly. But the moment you ask, "What is the mirror version of me?" it slips. Is it you in reverse? But reversed how? If the mirror inverts front and back, then why do you see left and right flipped? And if you hold up a sign in the mirror, why is the writing backwards? But more than that, what does it mean to be you in the mirror? You see the outside of yourself, but the image is hollow. The face is yours, but it has no voice. The smile is yours, but it feels delayed. You move, it moves. But which one is original? Which is the cause? Which is the copy? The paradox sharpens when you try to locate the self in the reflection. Is that image you? Or just light? Is it a version of you? Or just a reversed surface? If the mirror had a memory, if it could hold that image even after you walked away, would that version of you still be real? Now imagine you stand between two mirrors, infinite reflections, each slightly smaller, each vanishing into the distance. Which version of you is real? The first? The last question mark? The one that's watching? Or none at all? And now we loop. Because the mirror paradox isn't just about left and right. It's about reference. It's about systems that look at themselves. The mirror reflects the mirror. You reflect your own reflection. And suddenly, identity folds. Because every reflection you see is you, looking at a reflection of yourself, looking at a reflection of yourself. Where is the line? Where do you stop? And which version of you is real? When you look in the mirror, you see your face. But you can't see your eyes the way others do. You can't see your expression from the outside. You see an image built from light, but not from perspective. Your mirror self sees the world reversed. But it doesn't see anything. It doesn't think. It doesn't know. It only mimics. But mimicry is identity, in some sense. Because if it does what you do, moves when you move, thinks when you think, then what more is required to call it you? Except, it's not conscious. It's not alive. It's empty. But then again, how do you know you are? You think. You act. You reflect. But maybe that's all a mirror does too. And now we've looped back to the self. The mirror becomes a metaphor. You see yourself, but only from outside. You judge yourself by comparing what you see with what you think others see. You build an image and then forget it's not real. You become the mirror version of yourself, a reflection of expectation, a construct of light. So the mirror paradox isn't about physics. It's about identity in reflection. You can't see yourself directly, only ever in surfaces, only ever in feedback, only ever through mirrors, literal or social. And you believe that what you see is true. But it's not. It's reversed, or edited, or missing depth. The image in the mirror cannot show what's inside. It cannot capture your past, your mind, your thoughts, your pain. But it looks just like you. So you trust it. And every day, you look into it. And forget that the person looking back isn't you, but the version of you the world reflects. And the paradox? You begin to live as that version. You raise your right hand. They raise the left. And somehow, the mirror starts to lead.